Welcome to Mr. Nightbleed. Tonight, in 5 creepiest nights spent alone in abandoned burial grounds, we return to the forgotten edges of the world, places where footsteps echo too long and the dark has weight. These are the nights where a person stood completely alone, or so they thought. Every account you're about to hear is real, shared by those who swear something watched them from the shadows. Something ancient, something patient. My goal this month is to reach 4,000 subscribers. Almost 90% of viewers slip in, listen, and vanish into the dark without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Join the darkness. Subscribe now. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it there? And if there's a burial ground near your town that feels wrong, type its name below. Because when the night deepens and the world holds its breath, not everything beneath the soil sleeps. Kill the lights, silence the world, breathe slow, and let us begin. I never thought I'd put this out there, but I can't stop replaying it in my head. My name is Beatrice Larkin, and I'm from a small town called Kershaw, South Carolina. I don't make scary movies. I don't go ghost hunting. I shoot quiet little documentaries. Backyard beekeepers, old mill towns, a man who collects antique clocks. The thing that happened last year was supposed to be another quiet project. A short piece about what silence actually sounds like in places where people used to live and don't anymore. I had 2 locations lined up through a friend in Sofia and a translator driver named Mila who was doing me a favor for the adventure. That's how I ended up spending a night in a village cemetery abandoned after a plague a century ago. It wasn't dramatic when we got there. The place didn't look cursed. It looked like a field holding its breath. We bumped along a rutted road lined with hedgerows and came to a low stone wall with a rusted iron gate, kinked at an angle like a bent elbow. There were thin white birch trees scattered around, and wildflowers trying their best through ground that was more rock than soil. The village itself, Svetopetka, according to the faded sign, had a handful of stucco houses, most with shutters closed and roofs patched with whatever the owners had on hand. I saw laundry on 2 lines, a rooster pecking near a broken fence, and an old woman kneeling in a garden with a headscarf tied under her chin. It was late afternoon, the sky a dull aluminum color, the kind of light where everything looks like it has been wiped with ash. Mila parked by the gate, turned off the engine, and the car ticked as it cooled. She's a year or 2 younger than me. Dark hair pulled back, a little chipped black nail polish on each finger. She handles everything like she's already done it once. "We should find the caretaker," she said, pulling on a pilled sweater. "He lives near here. He wants you to sign that you understand it's not, how do I say, an official place." "Unofficial is okay," I said, getting out. My legs felt weird after 4 hours on poorly patched roads. Silence is silence. She smiled like that was naive and led me down a footpath through hawthorn bushes. We found him in a yard full of broken farm equipment and stacked bicycle tires. His name was Petrov, but I kept thinking of him as the caretaker even though he told us he didn't really take care of anything anymore. He was thin as rebar with a cigarette that seemed like part of his mouth. He wore a cap with a football club logo and a jacket that used to be nice. "No tourists," he told Mila in Bulgarian. "No phones, no candles. If she stays, she stays. No calling me at 2 in the morning because she is spooked." Mila relayed it to me and I said sure, of course. Petrov squinted past us toward the cemetery, then put out his cigarette, tucked it behind his ear as if saving it for later, and pointed with 2 fingers. He said something then and Mila didn't translate. She looked at the ground. When I asked, she waved it off. "Just village superstition. It's not important." I knew already he wanted money but wouldn't ask. I handed him an envelope with the equivalent of $50 and a printed form saying, "I absolve anyone of responsibility if I fall into a hole or get bitten by a dog." He signed with a careful hand, then took us back to the gate and showed me how to wedge a rock under it so it wouldn't swing in the wind and bang all night. The hinges were dry and the gate made a drawn-out barn squeal as he opened it. Petrov cleared his throat and said something else I couldn't parse, and Mila said, "He says you shouldn't walk near the eastern edge after dark. The ground sinks. It used to be a pit, like a mass grave?" I asked, and Petrov picked up the word grave and nodded once, eyes on my face like I would flinch. I didn't because I had decided this was a recording problem. Wind direction, crickets versus frogs, how to shelter the microphone. It's easier to think that way. I set up near the middle where the grass was shorter and the gravestones stood fairly straight. Some had plain crosses. Some had names etched in a Cyrillic that looked hand-carved and uneven. Lichen had eaten most of the lettering. There was a low concrete platform with rust circles where something metal used to be. A tiny glass lantern with a slit for a candle still hung from a hook. The glass so fogged it turned my fingers gray when I touched it. I wiped my hand on my jeans and went back to my gear. I use a Zoom H5 because it's simple and reliable. I have an XY capsule that fits up on top like a little set of ears. And I brought a Sennheiser shotgun mic too, something to reach across the field if a dog barked or a car passed. Wind was going to be my biggest problem, so I snapped on a Rycoat windscreen, the fuzzy dead cat, and taped the cables so they wouldn't thump against the tripod. I set the recorder at 96 kHz, 24-bit, named a folder, Svetopetka, set the file name prefix to SP011, and checked battery levels. Recommendations on forums say, don't rely on AA batteries overnight when it's cold, so I used a USB battery pack with Velcro and an elastic strap. I set the gain low and watched the tiny bars hop when I spoke. Test, I said, feeling stupid. Svetopetka Cemetery, 1842, mostly cloudy. Light wind from the west, temperature maybe 15 Celsius. Mila took a picture of me with her phone and said she'd go down to the village for water and something to eat, then come back to sit with me until 10. After that, she said, you are on your own until sunrise. We can't get back if I fall asleep driving. Don't worry. I have slept in stranger places for projects. A shrimp boat off Beaufort, a hostel room above a karaoke bar in Kyoto. I'm practical about tents and layers and snacks. I had a thin sleeping mat, a bivy sack, and a lightweight quilt I could pull over myself if it got cold. I had dry mango and almonds, little hotel shampoos for the morning, a headlamp with a red setting. I had a thermos of coffee and a way to tell myself this was work, not a dare. Near sunset, the bird noises changed. It's always a shift, from gossip to curfew, and then to the kind of high light chatter insects do when they don't know their sound carries. There was a thin smell of smoke from somewhere and a deeper smell like wet mineral and mushrooms. Mila came back with a loaf of bread wrapped in newspaper and a wedge of cheese and a bottle of water. She sat on the low concrete platform and ate slowly, watching me test levels on and off. Scratch a few lines in a notebook about the layout, the way the wall veered, the way the graves seemed to cluster as if people had buried their families as close as they could. That thing they say about plague pits, about how people had to bury quickly and carelessly, is something I've read and never had to stand next to. There was no sign of a pit, just grass that felt softer in one area and pressed down easily if you stepped on it. I avoided it because Petrov asked and because the recorder's tripod was already picking up vibrations when I shifted my weight. Sound is a stack of hands trying to touch you. I wrote once for a grant application like the brush of coats in a subway. Too many hands and you go numb. At 21:55, Mila checked the time, then stood and dusted off her hands. I'll be back before 7, she said. The sun will be up at 6:30. It's less dark after 4. Use the red light if you need to move. She looked around the same way Petrov had, like she was counting something. I asked her again what he said earlier, the part she didn't translate. Mila frowned. He said the last people who were buried there, they didn't get moved to the new cemetery because nobody claimed them afterward. And when you record, sometimes the microphone picks up voices. Not ghosts, just voices, bits of radio maybe. He says it happened to a man who came once with a big German tape machine. She shrugged. He's not technical. Radio bleed is real. I've caught church sermons in AM scratch on the edges of files and truckers talking somewhere in South Carolina, and once, what sounded like a baseball game in Spanish where there was no signal on my phone. It's messy. It's explainable. It's the kind of flaw you cut around. You'll be okay? Mila asked, and I said I would. She squeezed my shoulder and said, if you see a light moving near the east corner, sit still until it stops. Sometimes kids play there. And then she laughed at herself and said, God, I sound like a mother. And left the gate tilted just so, with the wedge of rock holding it from banging. After she drove away, the sound of the engine took a little while to drain out of the air. The graveyard doesn't have fences or trees that hold noise in. It's open to the fields and a shallow valley and then further hill country beyond. So sound moves and settles. A bell rang somewhere far off. Then a dog barked, and another dog, higher, made the same shape. Then the crickets took over the lower register, and the wind came up like breath through a cough. I sat on my sleeping mat, the recorder a foot away on its tripod, the shotgun mic aimed vaguely toward the middle of the cemetery where the stones were denser. I wrote timestamps every 15 minutes to mark the change in noise floor. I chewed almonds, I poured coffee. I felt the coffee move like electricity into my fingers. I had the headlamp off. The moon was behind the clouds, but they thinned occasionally and smeared a slow, pale light across everything so the stones looked like teeth. I thought about home. I thought about my dad replacing a squeaky hinge on the basement door when I was a kid, because the squeak gave my mom chills for no reason she could explain. It isn't the sound itself that scares you. It's your brain doing a shadow play in the corner with its hands. At 2350, the wind died and everything lifted. That's the sensation I always feel when the air goes slack, like the ceiling has moved up a notch and my ears missed it. The recorder's levels flattened into a soft lawn of static. There were tiny ticks I wanted to pretend were leaves. I wrote 2350, wind shift, calm. When the gate moved, it was a sound as clean as a fingertip tapping a glass. My chest did a little jump I would rather deny. Another tap, a slow click as the hinge settled, and then the faintest friction squeal that didn't carry so much as smear into the quiet. You know how you listen to see if a noise repeats? I did that. Nothing. I told myself it was the wedge of rock slipping. Don't be dramatic, B. You're alone and your brain wants company. I stood, careful with my boots, and crossed to the gate with the red light on my headlamp flaring a circle around my feet so I wouldn't trip. The rock had shimmied loose and was halfway out. I tucked it back under and whispered, "There," like I was calming a dog. The whisper of my voice sounded counterfeit in the open space. When I turned, something made a soft clack in the field beyond the wall. Not like a footstep, not exactly. Like a bottle knocking a stone. I let the light graze the grass and saw nothing. It's not strange to have trash in a field. It's not strange for it to move in a breeze. Back on the mat, I sat with my nails, pressed into my palms until my heart slowed enough to feel silly. The recorder's time code ticked along. Midnight passed. I don't have a thing about midnight. 2 and 3 a.m. or worse. Those times have a temperature to them. The clouds kept scudding fast, and now and then the moonlight slipped across the cemetery and made the stones into cheeks and chins for a second, then took it away. The first whisper was faint enough that I could have missed it. It came from everywhere and nowhere, the sound that breath makes when it curls the edge of a consonant. I leaned forward with my head tilted like a raccoon and almost laughed because of what I must have looked like. It happened again. A breath shape, then another. I watched the recorder. The meters didn't move. A whisper isn't a big sound. I adjusted the gain a tiny bit, then stopped because I didn't want to ruin the noise floor with handling noise, because I am disciplined and precise and not the kind of person who jumps at their own hair. I told myself it was wind teasing the grass in a strange way. It's the sound of a bow pulled lightly on strings. It's a word you can't hear unless you think you hear it. It's rabbits. It's my blood in my ears. I wrote Euro in 07, whisper, like it would look ridiculous later. The third time I felt the ghost of that air on my cheek. That's what made me swallow hard, not the sound itself. The sense that something had exhaled near my skin. I said out loud, "Anyone there?" Which is the dumbest thing I have ever asked a patch of weeds. The recorder caught the slight ragged rasp in my voice, and I hated that it did. There was no answer. A far train moaned in some other valley, long and sad, the kind of sound that gets inside your ribs. An owl made a single hoo. I waited another long minute and then told myself to move, to shift my legs so they wouldn't go numb. When I reached for the thermos, I knocked the notebook with my elbow and it fell with a flat, papery slither into the grass. I grabbed it, annoyed, and caught a smell. Then I hadn't noticed earlier. Not mildew, not decay. It was more like iron, and damp limestone like the interior of a hospital turned off and left to cool. If you're reading this thinking I'm building to some twist with glowing eyes and hands grabbing my ankles, I'm not. Nothing touched me. Nobody screamed. There was no demon, no witch. No miracle of voices swirling like a choir. What happened was small, and it was enough. The whisper came again, this time a little longer, like someone trying to speak with lips that wouldn't open easily. I locked my teeth together because I didn't want my own breathing to dwarf it. The recorder's levels barely ticked. When it finished, I heard another sound I hate to describe because it sounds like a story. The tiny click of a tongue on the roof of a mouth, disused, like a kid practicing the letter T. I kept still for God knows how long after that. My knees ached. The wind picked up again around 1:30, just as Mila had predicted when she checked the weather in the car, and with it came sounds I could name: leaves skittering, grass rubbing like a dry brush, a plastic bag cracking somewhere. The gate did its little tap dance and I let it. The whispers didn't return, or if they did, the wind took them apart. A few minutes after 2, there was the sudden, unmistakable beam of a flashlight on the far side of the cemetery. It cut a blade across the stones, then snapped off. My body didn't have a plan for that. Every sensible thought I owned jammed together in the doorway of my head and wouldn't let anyone through. If it was kids, fine, but kids don't turn their light off that fast unless they see something. I reached very slowly for the shotgun mic pistol grip so I could angle it, and the Velcro on the battery did that slow ripping sound that feels like a siren when you're trying to be quiet. The light flared again, but lower, like someone holding it against their leg. It made a lap around the east edge and then disappeared near the sagging corner of the wall. Mila had said if I saw a light, to sit still until it stopped. I sat still. I counted as far as 300. The beam didn't come back. I considered text messaging Mila, and then pictured her phone lighting up her face in a car on a dirt road and her not seeing the pothole and felt sick. There was a second beam then, far off, moving in a lazy side-to-side motion, not looking for me but doing a practical job of finding footing. A dog barked at it once and then thought better. The air tasted like someone had emptied a battery in my mouth. I fell asleep. Not long, maybe 15 minutes, because I jolted with the thing I always do where my thigh twitches like I've tripped. The recorder was still quietly breathing beside me. The thermos was tipped over but closed. The moon finally decided to be something and lifted a shabby light onto everything. I can tell you exactly where my hands were, tucked in my sleeves, and exactly how my leg went numb from the way I was sitting, because I kept flexing my toes in my boots until pins and needles became a clock. That's how slow it was after the lights. Slow and damp and starting to get in under my jacket. Here's the thing about sound. You don't always hear it right. Your brain tries to make it into words even when there are none, like when a fan makes a pattern and suddenly it's saying your name. I wasn't thinking about words when the whisper came back at 4:02. I know it was 4:02 because I looked at the recorder as if it would help me decode it. It was no louder than a breath against a reed, no more than the memory of a doctor leaning close in a quiet voice. It wasn't in my ear. It wasn't all around. It was just there. And the shape of it. This is the part that sits on my chest at night. My brain made it into English, even though everything around me was Bulgarian. My brain made it into, "We are still here." I closed my eyes because that was the only thing my body knew how to do. I didn't think ghosts. I didn't think curses. I thought of Petrov's cigarette and the empty houses and the fact that this place was not empty at all. It was full of the idea of people, and sound is a shape people leave behind without knowing. I opened my eyes. I didn't run. I didn't even stand. I stayed where I was because you can make sound worse if you chase it. The air had a slightly different temperature against my face, like exhale versus inhale near a window. The recorder's meters showed almost nothing. It was the kind of signal you pull up in post and it brings a mountain of hiss with it, and you ruin an afternoon trying to scrub it clean. The sky eased toward lighter gray. A lark did its idiot morning song like the world hadn't ended. When the sun finally scraped itself up and threw a little gold on the tops of the stones, my body gave me permission to stand. I packed slow like I was going to spook a cat. I turned off the recorder and the cessation of that tiny red rec dot felt like hanging up on someone. I walked to the gate and left the wedge in place because I didn't like the idea of it swinging while I wasn't there. On impulse, I went to the eastern corner where Petrov had told me not to walk. The grass had an odd give to it and I didn't try it. There were cigarette butts near the wall. New, not Petrov's brand. 3 of them in a row, filters pinched. Whoever had the flashlight last night had stood there a while. There were footprints, heel and toe, dried mud that might have been from a ditch beyond. Not a child's size, not a boot either. The pattern looked like a cheap sneaker. That made everything worse somehow. The ordinariness of it. Mila's car, when it pulled up at 6:48, made me weirdly teary the way hot food does after a long day. She opened the door and said, "You look like you slept on homework." And I told her about the light and she swore and scanned the field. I didn't tell her about the whisper, not yet. It felt fragile to say. It felt like if I moved it into air it would become something bigger than it was. She walked around inside the cemetery, hands in her sweater sleeves, then came back and looked at me like I needed instructions. "Coffee in the village," she said. "Then we go find a bathroom that isn't a hole. Then we show Petrov we didn't die." In the cafe there were 2 men with the faces of people who wake up before light and feed animals as a matter of course. They watched us in the way men watch 2 women they don't know in a place where they know everyone, which is to say, without animosity, just listening. The television over the bar was tuned to a morning program where a host with a too bright tie smiled at a weather chart. Our coffee came in cups the size of medicine and had sugar melted into it already. I held the heat in my palms and tried not to think about the phrase my brain had offered me at 4:02. When Mila asked finally what I had recorded, I told her it was mostly wind. Petrov took the second envelope because I insisted, and he didn't ask what I heard, which was his gift to me. On the road back toward Sofia, Mila put on a playlist of American songs from the early 90s. And I watched fields and then proper highways and then billboards and toy stores and the steel ribs of a stadium being built. I fell asleep with my head against the seatbelt anchor and dreamed that I had filled my recorder with breath and had to keep it underwater to keep it from escaping. I woke with a start, and since I can be dramatic in sleep but not in waking, I laughed and rubbed my face and said, "I have the audio. That's the important part." Back in the noisy world of home, it took me a week to gather nerve to listen in a serious way. I converted the files and put them into my editing software and watched the slow river of waveform crawl across the screen. I know what to look for. Faces in the noise, spikes that aren't insects. I ducked the low rumble of wind with a gentle shelf, put a narrow cut on a frequency that had a nasty ring. The night in Svetopetka was almost not a sound at all. It was the suggestion of one. At 0:07 there was a rise that might have been a whispered consonant. At 02:21 there was a soft plastic click I knew was the battery strap. At 04:02, very faint and at the ragged edge of human breath, there was something. If you've never listened to hours of ambient sound, you might not know the way your brain leans forward after a while and starts seeing patterns the way you see a face in trees. Our minds are ruthless about giving shape to random. I told myself that a dozen times as I looped that 5-second stretch until I knew every pixel on the waveform, like pieces on a table. I built a high shelf to push the air. I put a gentle upward curve at 2 kHz to catch the sibilance that wasn't there. I brought in an expander set very light to stop the hiss from swallowing everything when the sound dipped. What came out after that wasn't clear. It wasn't English grinning up from the mud. It was breath over reed, the shape of a phrase. The suggestion, only the suggestion, of "we are still here." I stood up from my desk and walked a circuit around my tiny kitchen like I had to warm my body back up from sitting. The refrigerator hummed. There was a dog barking 3 houses away in its own kind of shape. I told myself I had made it, that I brought it into being with plugs and knobs. I told myself to throw the takeaway, label it wind, or at least relegate it to a folder called Handfuls of Silence. I sat down again. I listened once more. I turned off the EQ and listened to raw, then to adjusted, then raw again. There it was and there it wasn't. I decided to send Mila a message, not about what it said, just that I had gotten something. I typed, "I think there's a breath-like voice on the file," and stared at it. The 3 dots came up instantly. She wrote, "From the village we always think the wind is speaking. It's a thing people say so they don't feel bad about leaving. Don't carry it like a brick." I wrote back a smiley I didn't feel and changed the subject to her dog because it had swallowed a sock last month and had to have a stern talking to. From the vet. It would be cleaner if I left it at that. Weirdness in a graveyard, weirdness on tape, we all go home and the world keeps its shape. But it followed me. And that's the part I don't understand because I don't believe in something following you from a patch of ground. I had other shoots. I sat in a retired ironworker's garage and recorded the clink of him sorting coffee cans of bolts. I laid on my belly by a marsh and caught the slow suck and push of water under reeds. I sat in my own living room at 2 a.m. and held a mic near the window to get the soft hoot of a train. I wasn't trying to conjure anything. I was trying to work. But every quiet room has a swell in it that feels like a person deciding to talk. And after Sveta Petka, that swell kept turning into a shape in my head. A week after I got back in my hallway with the AC kicking in, there it was again in the shallow duck breath, not a voice. The suggestion of one, bending itself over the air like a coat over a chair and becoming human. I called my dad because he's practical in the way of people who fix things that squeak and leak. He listened, bless him, to one of the less processed versions and said, "I hear the air moving and some little ticks here and there. If you want me to say I hear words, I don't. But I know your ears are better than mine." He asked if the recorder could have picked up a radio station, and I said maybe, but it didn't sound like that. He said, "What would it cost you to treat it like a sound and not like a meaning?" And I said, 8 hours in a gentle bed of noise for the film and a mention in the credits and then a quiet death on a hard drive. He said, "Then do that." I told him I would. I didn't. Instead, I played it again late at night when my apartment was drum tight and the only sound was the fridge and the high mosquito buzz of the streetlight bulb outside. I stood with my fingers touching the side of the machine the way you touch a cat to let it know you're there. I thought if I held it I might be able to feel the throat in it, the thing my brain wanted to draw around the air. I kept the lights off, not to be spooky, but because sound is easier in the dark. At some point I realized I had my hand on my own throat too, like I was checking if I was the one making the noise. I wasn't. I couldn't have been and not known. The last thing that matters is a detail that shouldn't matter. I was going to back up my project files to the cloud and discovered the folder for Sveta Petka had a subfolder I didn't remember making. It was called Old. Inside were 3 versions of S2007 that were identical in size. A day stamp I didn't recognize said they'd been created the afternoon after I got home. I never saw them. I opened one. At 04:02, the whisper-shaped breath was there, faint as always. But this is where I lose half the people who hear me tell this. There was also a voice farther down in the noise floor. Too low to register unless you build a house of EQ around it. A voice I know as well as I know my own because I spend hours a day sitting in my room, talking to a microphone and listening back to edit. It was me saying barely, "We are still here." There are a dozen ways that can happen, most of them boring. I could have run a test and forgotten. The recorder could have picked up a fragment of my whisper from earlier when I talked to it and dragged that shape into the dawn. There are imperfections in software. There are tiny shifts in perception when you're tired. I know all that. It doesn't stop the small ice cold of imagining my mouth forming words I didn't choose in a place where I had deliberately promised to take only what the night gave me. I didn't upload it. I didn't cut it into the film. The short ended up being about the way small towns fold their noise around you like a jacket. It had the ironworker, the marsh, the train, a shell of wind from the cemetery, but no voices. People who saw it called it meditative. Someone wrote kindly that I am good at listening. Every time someone says that, I feel the inside of my jaw go tight because I hear something other than what they hear. When I open my window at night, there's a pause where the air gathers itself, and I wait to see what my brain will make of it. Most times it's nothing. A few times it's the shape of words, and when it is, I turn on the sync just to give the air something else to ride so it won't choose that old shape again. A week ago, I got a postcard from Bulgaria with a picture of a sunlit street in Sofia, and a scribble from Mila I could barely read over the glossy surface. She wrote that Petrov had died over the winter, a small death, she said. The kind people barely talk about because it isn't dramatic, and that the village council had finally closed the gate properly and put a chain through the latch so kids would stop going inside at night. She said the laundry was back on the lines and someone had painted a fence. And the dog that barked once at the flashlight now has puppies under a porch. She told me to come back in spring when the fields go almost unnaturally green. I put the postcard on my fridge with a magnet shaped like a strawberry and stood there looking at it until my coffee went cold. I don't think the dead speak. I don't. But I think empty places remember how people sound, and sometimes your ears try to fill the space with a shape that feels right. I think we leave outlines where we've been, and microphones are bad at telling the difference between a voice and the memory of one. I sleep with a fan on medium now, which is a ridiculous solution because it makes the exact kind of endless whisper that caused the trouble, but somehow it's easier if it's steady. When the air conditioner kicks in and the duct blows over the door and the pitch changes as the compressor cycles, I tell myself this is just physics, and I believe it mostly. Then, in the part of the night where 2 and 3 a.m. smear together and the refrigerator hum lifts by a half step because something in it is getting tired, I count to 300 with my hands crossed on my chest and my mouth closed, and I don't ask if anyone is there, because I'm not sure I want to know, and I'm not sure I want to hear my voice answer. I never thought I'd write something like this where strangers could see it, but it's been hanging around like static in my ears. My name is Ruth Verma. I live on the edge of Shivpuri in Madhya Pradesh, about 10 minutes by scooter from the old royal burial ground everyone here just calls the Chhatri. People go there in the winter for photos when the mist makes the domes look like lanterns. I went there for a job, night guard. I took it after my mother's stroke because it paid $2,000 more than the textile shop, and the hours meant I could take her to therapy in the afternoons. That was how I ended up spending my nights among marble, bats, and the smell of damp stone. The first evening I reported in, the sky was still pink and dusty, and the caretaker, an old man named Omkar, showed me the keys and the logbook. He had a habit of lowering his voice when he said simple things, like he didn't want to wake the ancestors. "Don't write poetry in there," he joked, tapping the logbook with a brown fingernail. "Just the rounds, the times, any problems. Mr. Pathak wants everything neat." Mr. Pathak was from the district office and stopped by once in a while to talk about budgets and install a new lock every time a news story somewhere made him nervous. The burial ground is not what most people picture. It isn't graves in a row. It's small pavilions, chhatras, with carved pillars and a heavy central platform where the cenotaph sits. The biggest one, the Maharaja's, has lintels carved with peacocks and a ceiling that's browned from years of oil lamps. From far away, the whole complex looks like a cluster of white mushrooms sprouting from a scrubby lawn. Closer you see the chips in the plaster, the yellow lichens and the little nests mud wasps make in the stone seams. The walkways are gravel, then stone, then gravel again, where the renovation ran out of budget. When the night dew comes, the air smells like iron and something sweet, almost like guava left too long in a bag. My shift started at 7. Omkar would lock the car gate and leave by 8. After that, it was me, the stray dogs, and if I was lucky, Kalu, the tea seller who set up his cart outside the wire fence and kept odd hours. He had a little gas stove and always hummed the same 2 lines of a song while shaving ginger with a blade so dull it should have been a spoon. Sometimes police stopped, 2 constables and a scooter. They'd shine a torch around, drink tea, ask if there had been trouble, and leave. The CCTV screens in the tiny guard room showed 4 black and white views: the gate, the main pavilion, the back wall, and a dead zone full of bougainvillea that Pathak said was impossible to fix until the monsoon budget arrived. The screens weren't much use. Moths looked like comets in that shitty resolution. Those first nights went like you'd expect. I made my rounds, wrote the times in the logbook, practiced the habit of walking slow because fast feet sound like fear. I learned which lights took a second before they came on, and which ones blinked like tired eyes. I learned the sounds the place had at different hours. The thin hiss of the irrigation line at 9, the distant metal scream of the night train at 11, the coyotes or jackals, Omkar swore they were jackals, yipping around one, and the neighbor's rooster, confounded by streetlights, starting his day at 2:30. The echo in the main pavilion is a strange thing. It's not immediate. It comes back to you a half-second late, smaller, like a timid child following a parent too close. I noticed the footsteps on my 3rd week. It rained earlier that day, just a quick shower that leaves everything smelling like crushed leaves. When I walked from the guardroom to the Maharaja's pavilion, I heard my sandals on the gravel, then soft, slow steps behind me. Not light, not heavy. The rhythm was like mine had a delay. I stopped. The steps stopped at exactly the same moment. I turned around with the torch held stupidly high the way they teach you in the training video, as if the beam makes you bigger. No one was there, just the plume of my breath and the way the light made tiny spiders on the ground shine like they'd been dropped in mercury. I told myself it was the drainage after the rains, the little stones resettling under my weight. rocking, then falling back. I walked again. The steps came again in that same rhythm. Not quite an echo, but not quite someone else either. Every time I stopped, they stopped exactly there. When I tried to outsmart it by pretending I'd stop and then continuing, the steps lagged, then matched. It made my neck feel cold in a way the air didn't explain. Omkar laughed the next day when I told him, and not kindly. "This is why they don't put girls on night duty," he said, clucking his tongue, then saw my face and softened. "Are Baba, it's the acoustics. The chatras talk, it will settle." Later, Mr. Pathak, who arrived in his white Alto with dust always collecting on the windshield wiper, told me it could be a thief trying to scare me. "They move around like cats. Don't let them read your fear," he said, and promised to send Harish, another guard, to join me 2 nights a week until I adjusted. Harish was 22 and wore his watch over his sleeve like a commander. He brought a radio that played old Hindi songs with the treble turned too high, all cymbals and snare. The night he came, we didn't hear the strange footsteps. We walked the loop together and then split up and still heard nothing. "See?" he said at 3 in the morning, slapping the top of the CCTV monitor to settle the rolling image. "It's your mind. At night, the mind borrows noises." He had a tin of cheap cigarettes he hid in the broken part of the lower wall of the main pavilion. "Don't tell Pathak." But when it was just me again, the sound returned. The 7th night after Harish's visit, the steps were so clear that I felt the hair on my arms lift with each one. I tried to make a game of it. I counted my steps between the lamp near the banyan tree and the corner of the Maharani's pavilion. 38 walking normally, 30 if I took bigger strides. The following sound matched every time, 38, 30 a beat behind. I stood by the bronze plaque that tells tourists where to stand for the best photo and said out loud, "Whoever you are, I can hear you." My voice came back with the flatness of a classroom. No answer, only a faint drip somewhere, then far off a dog barked twice like a cough. There are practical things you do when you realize something's wrong, and I did them like a citizen in a pamphlet. I checked every lock twice. I made chalk marks across the thresholds that would snap if someone opened them between rounds. I pressed my palm against the dusty floor of the small servants' pavilion and lifted it to see if someone had passed recently. I laid my old dupatta in a way that would move if anyone brushed it. I wore my hair loose so a grabbing hand would have something to take that wasn't skin. I put my phone on record and slid it into my breast pocket, voice memo running every time I left the guard room. Yes, I know exactly how paranoid that sounds, and I know how silly it is to trust a microphone that also struggles to record a whisper at a family dinner. But a person will do ridiculous things at 2 in the morning, and everything at that hour feels like it makes sense. The recordings got wind noise, the scuff of my sandals, insects singing like machinery, and sometimes faint second footfalls perfectly spaced with mine. The weird thing was what I noticed on playback that I hadn't in the moment. In 2 of the recordings, when I stopped suddenly, there was a tiny high squeak before the last step, a shoe that needed oil, almost like a rubber sole catching. In another, a distant breathing came and went, almost like a snore's baby cousin. I didn't tell anyone about that because I didn't want it to be true. I told myself it could be me moving the phone against my shirt. It could be the wind boxing the microphone. It could be the sound of the old neon light buzzing down the lane. Anything was better than someone walking just behind me, tailoring their steps to mine, playing a game with rules only they knew. Kalu started showing up more often that week, or maybe I paid more attention. He set his cart a little inside the gate now because he said trucks passing were causing the tea glasses to rattle off and break. He made strong tea and poured extra milk when he thought I looked pale. "Any mischief?" he asked once, blowing on the steam and looking through the fence like it was television. "Only the usual," I said, and he grinned. "The usual scares are the ones that keep you careful." He lived in the Basti on the other side of the park and had 4 daughters, he said, and smiled when he said it like it wasn't a heavy thing to carry. One particularly quiet night he told me, plainly and without drama, that a man had tried to drag his cousin behind the railway shed back when he was a boy, and if she hadn't cracked him with her water pitcher, who knows, so never be embarrassed to shout. He said it like a recipe, like a thing you should know by the time you're old enough to stand in the dark. The more I listened, the more I noticed small changes. A light that always took a beat to come on now flicked instantly as if someone had just stepped out of its sensor. The thin rope that kept visitors from climbing onto the cenotaph was tied one way on my first round and another on my second. It could have been Omkar's absent-mindedness, but Omkar tied the same knot every time. A neat figure eight he learned in scouts. There were beetle spatters near the back wall that hadn't been there earlier. Once I found R's 10 note folded into quarters under the lip of the main steps as if someone had been hiding it and would come back. You see 100 little things in a place like that, and most of them are nothing. A handful of them are not nothing. And the trouble is, you never know which handful. 3 days before Diwali, the district did a photo op where a junior minister lit a lamp and promised better fencing. They left behind 2 garlands of marigolds and a stronger smell of hair oil than usual. Omkar asked me to leave the garlands on the hooks until the flowers went brown. That was when I did a stupid thing. I decided to take my mother's old umbrella with me on rounds. It was heavy with a metal tip and a little rust that made it stick when you tried to open it one-handed. I took it because it felt like armor, and because the baton the office gives us is the length of a forearm and makes me feel like I'm play fighting with cousins. If I am honest, I took it because I was tired of feeling like I was saying I am afraid with every step. The umbrella weight said something else. That night, the power cut at 1:30. The inverter in the guardroom beeped its long, sick tone and then fell quiet. The generator did its sound, a cough, a pause, a cough, cough, and then died. The lights in the pavilion turned to moonlight and the world got bigger. I stood still, let my eyes open like a camera, and walked with the beam of my torch set low so it wouldn't blind me into foolishness. Near the north wall, the footsteps came. Not from the gravel this time. From stone, slow, 1, pause, 1. I stopped, and they stopped, and something in me snapped. Not like bravery snapping into place, but like an old elastic breaking. And you don't have to be careful anymore because the thing that held you is gone. I turned off my torch. I waited 10 seconds. I counted aloud softly to 10 in Hindi, the way my mother counts when she steadies herself before standing. I took 3 steps forward, then 2 quick ones to the side, then 1 backwards, then stopped. Behind me somewhere, the steps tried to mirror it and were just a fraction wrong. The hair on my arms rose high and prickled, and I realized 2 things at once. Whoever it was couldn't see me clearly, and whoever it was had learned me. They knew the pacing I used when I was nervous. They had practiced stopping when I stopped. They had been doing it long enough to enjoy the part where my body wanted to turn around and my brain said, don't. I walked towards the Maharani's pavilion because that one has the best vantage. The plinth is wide and you can see the main path. My plan, if you can call it that, was to use the low step to make a sound I could tell from theirs, then swing the umbrella if anything broke silhouette. It's a terrible plan. It's what I had. I moved, and the following steps moved, and at the edge of my hearing there was that tiny rubber squeak again, like a well-used sole on stone. I could feel my heartbeat push against my ears, a hot throb like water being pumped by hand. The moon was bright enough to make the white stone glow, and my shadow was a smeared shape next to the carved pillar. I placed the umbrella on the step and dragged it just so to make a long scraping sound, and then stepped aside, fast, pressing my back to the pillar. A shape moved where I had just been. It wasn't clear. A taller dark inside the general dark. A person, because of the way the head shifts when someone looks without wanting to announce they are looking. He or she, I can be fair and say I didn't know, but it felt like he stood exactly where I had stood a second before and did not move. My mouth filled with the taste of coins, that metallic sour thing, and I thought, if he reaches out, that will be the point of everything. He did not. He stood there, and then he took a step to the side the way I had done earlier, and that was worse because it meant he had seen me do it and filed it away like a trick he could reuse. I lifted the umbrella, held it like a spear, and in a voice that came out sounding like my aunt when she scolds children, I said, "Bass, enough, show me your face. We will go to the police now." My words seemed to touch the stone and fall to the ground. The shape turned its head in my direction, but not towards my voice, more like towards my breath. We were both very still for a small forever, when the generator churned back to life with a phlegmy wheeze. The lights blinked and the white glare washed the shadows thin, and for an instant I saw a reflection in the glass of the showcase holding the Maharani's silver puja lamp. Not a face, not features, just a hat. A cap pulled low. It could have been anyone. It could have been no one. When I swung the umbrella, it hit nothing, and when I took 2 quick steps forward, there was no resistance, no sound of retreat. The space where he had been was just air and the smell of a man who uses a mint-flavored pan masala. I ran after that, and I hate that I did, because running is what they want you to do if they want to see where you go to feel safe. I ran to the guard room and slammed the door and threw the bolt. And the bolt, which usually slides smooth, caught halfway like something had swollen, and that little hesitation made me want to kick the wall. I called 100, then S.I. Sharma directly because he'd given me his number once when he was gossiping about a stray cow that wandered into a temple. He said he'd send a man. He asked if I was sure it wasn't a dog. He told me to stay in the guard room and not be a hero, and I said I wasn't trying to be anything. When he hung up, I realized both my hands were shaking, and I pressed them flat on the logbook to flatten them like cloth. When the two constables arrived on a scooter, their headlight swept the fence like a lazy searchlight. They stomped around with their heavy boots, talked loudly on purpose, and made the place feel briefly like just a garden, just a place with trees and stone. They found nothing. No footprints in the damp dust under the plinth except mine and theirs. The chalk marks were unbroken. One of the constables shone his torch under the lip of the main step and found my Rs-10 note from 3 nights ago. He wiped it on his shirt, gave it to me like a prize, and said, "Sometimes fear is a moneylender. It gives you back more than you left." He meant to be kind. He drank Kalu's tea and made a show of enjoying it too much. Before he left, he said, "If you want to transfer, ask Pathak. There's no shame." Then more gently, "In places like this, the mind chews its own chewing." I didn't ask for a transfer. I told myself I wouldn't let someone drive me away from what I needed to do for my mother, from the rent that had to be paid, from the drip schedule of her morning medicines that was only possible because my nights were occupied. I came back the next night with inner souls that didn't squeak, and my phone charged and a second torch just in case. I changed some of my habits. I varied my route. I did some rounds in reverse. I stood in the shadow so I could listen. When the footsteps came, I did not stop cleanly. I slowed gradually so the sound had to reveal whether it was following me or following itself. Whoever made those steps adjusted too. At 1:15, they matched me again. Slow, not heavy, patient. I set my phone to record. I set in the logbook the exact time. I set small traps. On the second round, one of the traps was not as I left it. There is a little broom the cleaning boy leaves by the stand for flower offerings. Just 3 sticks tied with twine. I had propped it at a slant against the cenotaph. If someone walked close and brushed it, it would slide. When I returned, it had slid, and the twine had a tiny smear of red like pond that someone tried to wipe on a corner. I crouched, touched it with the corner of my dupatta, and a smell hit me that was not the marigold rot or the usual stone sweat. It was a sharp, clean smell under the mint, a cheap aftershave my cousin used in college. Something about it made my skin crawl, not because of the fragrance itself, but because the man had been close enough to leave it. Harish came for his scheduled night, and I didn't tell him everything. He was all swagger until the power went again and the generator took its time. And then he wasn't. We walked single file through the center walkway, me in front because I knew the way my torch needs a tap, him behind whistling a film tune too cheerfully. The following sound came as we passed the Maharaja's pavilion. It matched us, and when I stopped, Harish stopped late, and then the echo of that stopped later, and all the timing was wrong, and I felt the goosebumps climb my back like a small animal. I whispered, "Do you hear that?" And he said, "It's the echo," but his voice had a low shake. We waited. The sprinklers came on. A fine mist drifted through the moonlight and turned each beam into lace. The steps did not come again, and if you want to think we were both being silly, you can. I wish I did. 2 days later, just before dawn turned the sky that beige that makes everything look tired, I found something else. There's a narrow service door at the back of the main pavilion used by the electricians, so they don't have to lay cable through the front steps when they check things. It has a little space behind it before the corridor opens out. I had never paid attention to that space because it smelled intensely of rat urine. That morning a gleam caught my eye. A small silver packet sat there, the kind with a stringless tea bag torn open and used to hold something else. Beside it, 2 matchsticks. The match heads were scraped and pale. I know this detail because I picked them up in a tissue like a crime show person and let them sit in my pocket, because there are kinds of men who like to keep their hands moving in the dark. When I told Omkar later, he shook his head and said the electricians sometimes eat there. "Tell them not to," I said. "Tell them to stop smelling like someone who waits." I started talking out loud more than I realized. A thing arrives and you try to make a home for it, even if it arrives at the wrong hour. I talked to my mother on the phone at 1 in the morning, discreetly when she couldn't sleep. I told her about a cat that never actually showed up. I told her about a bat that hit my shoulder and I pretended it scared me, but it didn't, because small flying things are just doing their job. I didn't tell her about the steps. I didn't tell her because she would remember the time in school a man followed me halfway home, and I didn't tell anyone, and then he called our house because he had memorized the sticker on my school bag. She would remember, and then I would be the girl again, not the person holding the keys to someone else's history. When you are being watched, your body knows before your mind admits it. The shoulder blades tense, the mouth goes dry as sand, your ears get greedy. I started having a headache above my eyebrows like a tight band, from constantly trying to hear something better. I woke with tiny muscle cramps in my feet from keeping my toes ready to push off. Kalu noticed first. "You're losing weight," he said without the fake admiration that people sometimes give like a compliment. "I'll make you tea with more sugar. Don't argue." He leaned in that night without asking and whispered, "Someone's been asking your timing." I felt my insides turn liquid. "Who?" he shrugged. "A boy I didn't like. He had a cap. He pretended to look at the menu and then asked whether you go home at 4 or 4:30, as if it mattered to the tea. I told him sometimes 3, sometimes 5, which is a lie. I'm sorry. I thought it would help. It did not help. My scooter's headlight suddenly seemed like a flare announcing me. I started parking closer to the gate and leaving with a police scooter if they happened to be there. On nights when they weren't, I waited for the vegetable seller's trucks at 5 and drove behind them like a chick behind a mother hen. I showed S.I. Sharma the matchsticks and the torn tea packet, and played him the recordings on my phone. He listened the way men listen when they know you can't say anything that has a perfect edge. "We'll increase patrol," he said. "You can always shout. We're nearby." He asked if I could describe a face and I said no, and his shoulders relaxed a fraction as though that made it less real. 2 weeks after all this began, Mr. Pathak installed a new light by the back wall and a sign that said, "Under surveillance" in bold letters. The camera wasn't hooked up yet, but the sign made him feel like he had done a big thing. He also gave me a small body camera still in the box. "For your peace," he said. "It records for 4 hours. I wore it once." The strap felt like a hand around my ribs. I wore it a second night because not wearing it felt like a dare to whoever had learned me. The first night's recording was mostly of my chin and a blur. The second night's caught something nonsense. 2 seconds of a shadow that did not match mine in length because the light source was different. It was the kind of artifact that skeptics show to say, "See, your eye wants patterns." I watched it 5 times and then closed my laptop and put it under my mattress like a teenager hiding a magazine. Everything culminated on a night so warm and still that the insects sounded like a single thick note. I had been walking with the umbrella in my left hand, baton in my right, which is also ridiculous because you cannot use 2 hands at once. There was a smell of kerosene in the air because someone had been burning trash down the road, and the smoke had drifted and hung a little under the arches. Around 2 as I passed the Maharani's pavilion, something ticked to my left, very small like a fingernail on glass. I turned my head and that was all it took. From behind, a hand reached and touched, not grabbed, not yanked, just touched the end of my hair. A single touch at the tips, a hello almost polite, and my body turned to salt. I spun and swung both umbrella and baton, and hit nothing with the baton and a pillar with the umbrella, metal on stone ringing like a bell. I shouted without words, and that surprised me most, that it wasn't stop or who, but more animal. The following step stumbled once, and that was new. He hadn't stumbled before. I stepped forward, and the person must have stepped backward because I sensed the air shift away. Something fell, a soft clatter. I shone the torch down and there was a cap. A plain navy cap with sweat marks on the inside band. I snatched it with the umbrella end like a fisherwoman lifting a fish. I wanted to scream and I wanted to laugh at the same time because, what is a navy cap? A navy cap is nothing. It is proof of nothing. It is an object that says someone was here, and then 100 people always say someone is always here. It is a public place, so what did you expect? Private air. I backed into the torchlight and the cap swung and bumped my knuckles, and that little domestic sensation brought the world back into focus. I shouted again, words this time, and Kalu's dog barked from beyond the fence and the footsteps retreated. Down the side path, then over the gravel. Then they were the high ticks of a climb over the wire at the far end where the bougainvillea makes a curtain. Sharma came. He took the cap in a poly bag. He made a small mocking face at the brand stitched inside. He shone their big torch over the far wall and pointed to a bend where dust collected on the stone had been scuffed once. "He's been coming and going there," he said, and then almost kindly, "You should take some leave." In the days that followed, a man in a cap passed 3 times outside while the tea cart was there, and then vanished when 2 policemen were parked within sight. The recordings on my phone got, if anything, more boring. It was as if, after the cap, the steps decided that part was done and no longer needed to make music to stay with me. I stopped sleeping properly. Not from fear exactly, but from how the nights made me long and stretched inside. My mother asked why my voice sounded thin. I lied about a cold. A neighbor said she saw a man on the stairs of our building at 2 in the morning, standing on the landing between our floor and the next, pretending to check his phone, and when she asked who he was visiting, he smiled too wide and said, "A friend," and then left without knocking any door. The neighbor is old and likes to feel important. That is what I told myself. A week later, I found a small folded paper packet slipped under our door. It was empty and smelled to me like the tea bag packet from before, but it could have been anything. A wrapper from the spice cellar that fell from a delivery boy's pocket. I threw it away and then dug it out of the bin an hour later with my fingers and sealed it in a plastic box like a crazy person. I handed in my resignation the next month. I told Mr. Pathak my mother needed me at night. He accepted it quickly, too quickly, as if he had been waiting for me to be sensible. He hired a man with a mustache and a way of standing that says he has been in the army even if he hasn't. He told me that Harish would take more shifts, and they would fix the cameras, and would I sign that I understood I had not been assaulted on property. A formality. I signed. On my last night, Omkar brought me a steel box of lattice and said I'd done well. Kalu gave me a cup of tea for free. He watched me drink it and then said, "Whatever it was, don't teach yourself to ignore your neck." It took me a second to understand. He meant the way skin knows. "Some of us keep paying attention," he added, and I said I would try. I found a day job at a pharmacy, scanned strips of paracetamol, learned to say allergic in English without swallowing the L. The nights got smaller again and the mornings were no longer a struggle through molasses. I told myself I had put that period away like you put away woolens in summer, and for weeks it stayed put. Then the pharmacy manager asked if I could cover an evening shift. I left at 10. The road home is a straight line across the railway and then a right turn by the school. A train had just gone. The air smelled like coal dust and hot steel. I walked because my scooter had a puncture and the repair shop was shut. Behind me, not close, not far, I heard a step. It matched mine in a way that made my stomach do that small drop like when an elevator starts moving. I slowed and it slowed. I stopped and it stopped. The night was loud with insects and a drunk was singing somewhere like he was scolding a cloud. I turned and saw no one, and it should have ended there. I told myself I was hearing my own shoe. I told myself the noise from the line can echo. I told myself so many things. In my bag, I still had the body camera. I don't know why. I had never returned it to Pathak. On a bench in our building's compound, a new watchman was dozing with a sawn-off stick on his lap, mouth open. I climbed the stairs. 2nd floor, 3rd. Our landing smelled like boiled milk. As I neared my door on the 4th floor landing above, a man shifted his weight. It was a tiny sound. You know it when a person redistributes himself from one leg to the other. I did not look up. I walked to my door and put the key in and pretended to fumble, and in that second I slipped the body camera's clip over my dupatta edge and pressed the button. It hummed. I went inside. I put on the chain. I stood for 10 minutes with my ear to the wood. There was no sound from the stairs now. I made my mother tea. I watched her breathe. The camera blinked its small red eye to say it had done what it could do. In the morning, I played the footage back on my old laptop while my mother read the paper article about a cow that ate fireworks and survived. The image was bad. The sound was worse. The lens had caught only a slice of the hallway light and a hazy shadow when someone had stepped between bulb and floor in a way that meant they were not at my door. The only clean sound it caught, aside from the key in the chain, was this. When I opened my door, another door, not on my floor, opened too in perfect time and then shut without comment. That could be a neighbor coming home. That could be a coincidence. I know, however, what my neck knows. There are nights when I can stand at our window and hear the small world going about its business. Bikes, distant laughter, pressure cookers releasing their little sigh, and under it, If I'm very honest and do not blink and do not try to own the sound by naming it, I hear steps on the stairs. Slow, patient. 1. Pause. 1. They stop when I stop breathing. They start when my chest remembers how. They belong to a person who learned my walking the way a child learns a prayer, by repetition, by making the rhythm his. They might belong to no one at all. Either way, some mornings I find a folded paper circle on the floor near our door, like those wrapped sugar packets from chai stalls. Empty, clean, smelling faintly of mint and something sharp that I cannot name. And on those mornings I open the window wide to let the air through because stale rooms make you imagine things. The empty circles don't mean anything. They don't prove anything. They are not a note. They might have been under someone else's door and blown by the draft. I keep the cap Sharma took a photograph of saved on my phone. In the picture it looks like a small blue mouth turned upside down, ready to speak if you turned it the right way. I don't show it to anyone anymore. I walk differently now, not faster, not slower, just with the shoulder that faces the wall a little higher and my keys held firm and the part of me that wants to run answering to another part that will not. In the pharmacy, I look up when the door chime rings and there are times when a man in a cap and good shoes walks in and asks for shaving blades. And I hand him what he wants and watch the way his fingers move and hear nothing special. There are other times when the street is empty and I hear the echo of my own feet on stone that isn't there, and I'm back under the chatras with the lights waiting to hesitate. On those nights, if I wake in the bathroom without remembering how I walked there, I wait, very still, and count to 10, and sometimes I swear I can hear another person somewhere in the building doing exactly the same. I don't have proof. That is the worst and the truest part. The steps behind you don't need proof. They need you to listen long enough that you carry them with you wherever the ground is, and if there's anything I've learned, it's that once you learn the rhythm, it's hard to be sure whose it is. I never thought I'd write any of this down, but I'm sleeping with the lights on again and it feels like if I don't tell someone, it'll start to spill out another way. My name is Marjorie Sen. I'm from Berhampur in Murshidabad district, West Bengal, on the slow bend of the Bhagirathi. I moved to Kolkata years ago and rarely went back except for festivals and funerals. But last winter my uncle died and left me his locksmith shop. I went to close it up and sort through the ledgers, and that's when I heard about the fire that never went out. My uncle's shop sat on a lane that still smelled like brass and mustard oil, not far from where the old road drifts down to the cremation ghat that nobody uses anymore. The municipality built a new electric facility near the hospital, so the old steps by the river went quiet. Kids cut across the grass there to get to school. Lovers met at dusk and swatted mosquitoes, and stray dogs slept on the warm stones in the afternoon sun. The only people who really had business there were the tea seller who set up a small brazier by the banyan roots, and a man named Nirmal, who had a key to the iron gate and kept it from rusting shut. It was Reena, my uncle's neighbor, who brought it up. She came over the first evening with a steel tiffin of fish curry and rice, and looked at the keys and pins on my uncle's workbench like they might speak to her. She is the kind of woman who still keeps a hand towel over her shoulder and clicks her tongue when she's thinking. "Don't go to the old ghat after dark, Marjo," she said, using my childhood name. "These days big boys drink there. And there is this nonsense also. People say one funeral fire never went out." I laughed the way you do when you want to show you're not drawn in. "At a wet riverbank in winter? It would have to be magic." "Magic, no," she said. "The wind keeps low in that pocket. Ghee sinks into stone. Ask Nirmal, he will tell you." The next morning I went to the shop early and opened shutters that screamed at the hinges. The narrow room smelled like iron filings and old paper. I found stiff ledgers, a brass scale, a cracked mirror. My uncle's hand had grown slanted and shaky in the last pages, numbers trailing off in dust. I spent hours trying to make sense of what to keep and what to toss, and by late afternoon I needed air. I took a thermos of sweet tea and walked down to the river. The old ghat is 3 flights of wide stone steps that slope into the water, chipped from years of wood and feet. The river there makes a small eddy that curls like a sleeping cat's tail. The air carried that winter smell I've always known. Smoke from fields, a little green from the water, something sour from the mud. You can hear the highway farther off like a hive, but near the bank it's different. Wood knocking wood somewhere, a bicycle bell, the thin calling voice of a hawker selling peanuts. I sat on the lowest step where the sun warmed the stones and sipped 2 sweet tea. A dog with a torn ear came to see if I had anything better. "Don't feed him biscuits," someone called from behind me. I turned to see a thin man in a worn sweater and rubber sandals standing by the banyan, a ring of keys sagging from his belt. He had the look of someone who used to be strong and then had to learn patience with his own body. "He will follow you home and bark when you go inside." "You're Nirmal?" I asked. He nodded. "You are the niece. Your uncle used to keep a spare key for me for the main gate when I lost mine. He was never fussy. He repaired the lock at the temple without taking a rupee. I told him I was cleaning up the shop and that I'd heard a story about a fire that didn't go out. He smiled without showing his teeth. "People like to make things bigger," he said. "One night some idiot poured too much ghee and kerosene for an old man's pyre, and the fire soaked the stones black. The wind held there that night. People said the stone itself was glowing later. Then they said it was still warm in the morning. Then they said it never went out. If there is any flame, it is the boys who come with a bottle and a match." "And the shadow?" I said and regretted it. The chai seller had mentioned it too, in the sing-song way of someone repeating a joke. "A shadow that stood inside the flame at 3 in the morning. "Shadow is just a shadow," Nirmal said. He looked at the dog, then at the river. "Don't stay late," he added, like a father to a child. That should have been the end of it, but once someone puts a small pebble in your shoe, you notice it every step. I started seeing things that could fit the story if I wanted them to. A smear of ash where no one had burned anything that day. Soot caught in a crack 3 steps up. Matches at the edge of the grass. For 2 nights I went to bed early and told myself I wasn't thinking about it. Then woke at 2 and sat in the dark, listening to the slow hum of the town and the occasional snap of a firecracker from boys testing their patience. The 3rd night I messaged my cousin Anup to come by just to have someone around. He showed up after work with a bag of samosas and tea and told me about an account at his office that had gone bad. "You're getting lost in dead men's junk," he said, swallowing half a samosa in a bite. "Burn everything, take the cash, lock the shop, and come home to the city." "I will," I said, "after I look in the back room. I think he stored customer keys that were never picked up. I don't want to throw something important." "I knew you would say that. You were always the last one in the museum when they closed the doors." He left after 10 with the leftovers and a joke about ghosts. I watched his taillight slide away and listened to the building settle. There's a particular sound old shutters make when they move at night, a hollow spring sound, and it always made me think someone was nudging them with a finger. I made a bed on the floor because the cot smelled faintly of mildew and something medicinal, and I lay down with my sweater rolled under my head. It was cold enough to feel it in your fingernails when you took your hands out of the blanket. I fell asleep listening to a dog bark twice, pause, and bark again, like it was telling a story to itself. At 2:30, a scooter passed in the lane and woke me. I went to the back to use the toilet and I heard very distinctly a small metal clink like a ring of keys tapped against a stone. You know how a sound can be nothing in the day and everything at night? I stood still and listened. It didn't come again. I washed my hands and watched the water run rust brown in the basin and told myself I was being silly. I put on my shawl and stepped into my chapels, and before I could argue with myself, I was on the lane, and then I was walking toward the river with my phone flashlight low. It was a moonless night, the kind where the sky feels heavy and low. The air along the river changes after midnight. You smell more water and more cold, and the distant noises seem to get farther away as if someone is turning a knob. The banyan tree made one shape against the sky. The gate to the steps was shut but not locked, and whoever had last closed it had tied a small length of rope in a lazy loop so a child could open it. I undid the rope and slipped through and held my light close. The beam picked up the smooth sheen of the stone steps and the glitter of mica in them. Farther down, just where the river touched, there was a black glistening stain that looked wet again. The smell was like old lamp oil and something animal. I stood there and told myself to go back and then stayed because curiosity is an anchor. My phone read 2:57. I sat on the second step and watched my breath. When you sit still this long, you start to hear the small things. The click of water touching stone, the pebbly shuffle of a crab, the nervous flitting of a bat. At 3 not exactly, my phone buzzed from some automated message about data balance, and that's when the flame rose. It came up like a breath pushed through a lung. 1 second there was dark, and the next a low orange column bowed upward from the stain at the water's edge like somebody lifted a veiled lampshade from a lantern. It wasn't the bright blue you get with gas. It was dull and thick, orange and then deeper orange licking at air that looked like heat on a summer road. It made a sound like a sigh against metal. Behind it, within it, however you want to say it, a shape appeared and started to move. Not dancing, not even swaying, just rising straight up. A man-shaped absence in the middle of the light. I didn't scream. I remember that like a strange point of pride. Instead, my whole body went hot-cold like a fever breaking, and I stood up so fast I kicked my thermos. It rolled down 2 steps and hit the edge with a ding that felt too loud in that place. The shape paused. My flashlight was still on and pointing down and caught the reflection of something small and round near the stain. A metal cap with threads. I realized I was seeing pieces, not a miracle. There was something in the step itself and something under the water. The person in the flame, if it was a person, stood so still I thought it might be a board or a cutout. Then it moved, a clear shift of weight. Each time it moved, the flame broke around it in a way that felt real. I took 1 step back and my heel clicked a stone. The shape turned. Through the heat shimmer, I thought I saw a profile, a shoulder, the impression of wet cloth catching light. It felt impossible that someone could stand that close to fire and not flinch. But then I remembered the way fishermen I'd seen in winter would pour water over their hands before lifting a hot plate. And I remembered chemistry class with spirits burners and how a wet towel can take a brief kiss of flame. I don't know why that's the thought that came. "Who's there?" I said, because nothing else was available. Nothing answered. The flame dropped a little as if something that fed it was spinning closed. I heard very faintly a small hiss and the thump of something hollow underwater. The figure stepped sideways out of the heat and became a shadow among shadows. For a second I lost it completely, and then caught the edge of a shoulder again where the river is lighter than the bank. The person moved with careful steps and then the sound changed, more splashing. And I realized whoever it was had slipped into the river and was wading along the base of the steps. I ran. I'm not proud of that either, but I did. I climbed ungracefully, tripped at the top, scraped my palm on a brick, got to my feet and nearly plowed into the gate. Something behind me made a soft clank, and then another, and then silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty because your blood is loud in your ears. When I looked back, the flame was gone. In the place where it had been, there was a darker black, a strip of wet with a slick on top. The smell was stronger. I tied the gate rope wrong twice and then left it untied and walked fast to the lane, then faster. Then didn't slow down until I was inside the shop with the shutters drawn and the bolt slid. I sat on the floor and listened to the night run past. At 4, a rooster betrayed itself early. At 5, a milkman's bicycle rattled a crate. When it was light enough to tell gray from blue, I washed my scraped hand and swept the shop until I had convinced myself what I saw had a human explanation, and therefore wasn't allowed to undo me. I waited until a decent hour and went to find Nirmal. He hadn't set up his stool by the banyan. I found him by the tea stall instead, holding a glass by the rim, blowing on it. He listened without interrupting. He didn't say he believed me. He didn't say I'd had a little panic attack by the river. Sometimes boys set a thing on fire to scare people, he said at last. Sometimes there are other reasons to make people stay away from a place. What reasons? Smuggling, storing, meeting. Better for the police to say illegal liquor than to say a woman fell. People hear liquor and they stop asking, "Have you seen it?" He looked over my shoulder at the water as if it might answer for him. "I have seen a light there twice. I have not seen a person in it." He finished the tea, turned the glass upside down on the saucer and sighed. "If you are going to look again, don't go alone. And don't go. But if you will, then don't go alone." It would have been sensible to stop. It would have been sensible to call Ann up and tell him I was spooked and to come down and help me finish faster. Instead, I went to the police outpost near the market and told the sub-inspector on duty that I'd seen men at the abandoned Gat at 3 in the morning with some contraption that set off a dangerous flame. He had a face built for boredom. He wrote my name down and asked my father's name and nodded over my story. "We go there sometimes," he said. "We chase boys away. If there is something underwater, they will take it away in the day. Come back tonight if you wish. We will send a constable with you." "I don't need a constable with me," I said faster than I meant to. I have a friend coming." That afternoon, my friend appeared in the form of a traveler who drank tea at the shop and asked me in careful Bangla if the old Gat was worth seeing. He was a skinny man in his late 30s with a canvas bag and the leathery skin of someone who spent time outside on purpose. His name was Bernard, he said, and he'd come from Shillong on work and had a day to kill. He told me he liked rivers. I heard myself asking if he had strong shoes and if he could keep a secret, and there I was, pulling someone else's curiosity into mine. We went just before sunset so we could see the ground by light and not rely on our phones. The air had that warm, cold tremble it gets when day drops away, and somewhere a radio played an old song that made me think of a wedding I went to when I was 12. We walked the steps, each one scuffed and etched with long scratches like somebody had dragged a trunk. Bernard crouched at the edge and touched the black stains. "Sticky," he said. "Smells like kerosene and clarified butter. If you poured ghee onto stone and then kept burning it, it would soak in. But for a flame to rise on its own at 3 in the morning, that needs fuel and a trigger." We found a small screw-on cap, the kind that fits a narrow metal tube. Farther up the steps, half hidden in a crack, there was a piece of rubber that had gone brittle. We followed the crack as it snaked up toward a patch of loose mortar near the 3rd step. If you ran your hand along the wall there, the stone felt hollow behind it. Bernard knocked it with his knuckles and grinned in that way men grin when they've been challenged by a puzzle. On the top landing, not far from the banyan, there was an old plinth where a shrine might have stood. Behind it, in the shadow, a stone slab sat askew, and when Bernard got his fingers under it and lifted, rats yowled and scattered and the smell was like a long-closed trunk. Inside was a rectangle of mere underground, cool and damp. The air smelled like clay and old fire. There were little shelves cut into the earth, and on one of them, we found a coil of tube that matched the brittle piece in the crack. A small wrench with river rust on it, and a can that had once held mustard oil but now smelled sharply of something else. We also found, in a cloth bag tied with string, a cheap alarm clock without a top, the hand set to 3 hours, and a small battery pack with leads. Bernard sucked in his breath softly as if he'd been hoping to be wrong. He turned the bag over in his hands. "Someone set this to open or spark at a time when most people are asleep," he said. "They were feeding something from this recess down to the step. A thin gas line? Or they primed a wick and ran oil down and then an electric spark lit it." He looked at me. "It could be a signal, or it could be a story someone tells so you don't come down here at night and find the real thing." "What's the real thing?" He didn't answer immediately. He held up the alarm clock as if it might answer for him, then set it down and wiped his hands on his pants. "Whatever you don't want your mother to see," he said lightly. "A meeting. A trade account. There are little places like this all over India, and people use them because people don't look. Fire makes people not look. We put everything back because that felt safer than walking out carrying it." As the last light went, Nirmal appeared at the top of the steps like he'd grown from the tree. He frowned when he saw Bernard. "I told you not to go alone," he said, which in his mind probably counted as "I told you not to go. If you saw anything, you did not see it from me. I am not wanting trouble. We won't drag you into anything," I said. "We're just going to sit nearby. If the flame comes, we'll see who comes for it. People who do these things have eyes in the back," he said. "Don't sit near. Sit from the roadside. And you will not be brave. You will go if you don't like it." We took his advice. We found a spot on the lane above the gate behind a low wall and crouched there with 2 old shawls in my thermos. The temperature dropped fast. You could see your breath in the light of the street lamp, which hummed and ticked and threw faint bugs on the wall. Somewhere a lorry's horn rose and fell stupidly on the highway. Bernard didn't talk much, which I appreciated. He handed me a packet of glucose biscuits and I broke them and fed 1 piece to myself and 1 to the thought that I would be embarrassed if nothing happened. At 2:45, a dog trotted down the lane, sniffed our wall, and moved on. At 2:50, a small hatchback rolled past. The driver's face blue-white in his dash light. At 2:56, my phone began to lose charge faster as cold ate it. I had the feeling you get when a train is approaching on a track you're not sure you're standing on. At 3 down, the street lamp flickered once, and down on the steps, the orange came up as if someone had opened a tap in the dark. It wasn't as dramatic from above, but it might have been worse because you could see more. You could see the thin, almost invisible shimmer in the air that moved like breath. And you could see something brighter underwater, a pulse that matched the flame, and you could see that there was absolutely a person down there standing where a false comfort would be to call a trick of light. They were barefoot or looked it. They wore dark, wet fabric that clung and smoked and something on their head like a hood. They turned their face away from the brighter part and raised a hand in front of it and stood there, not making any of the flailing movements I expected from someone too near fire. Bernard's hand touched my sleeve. It was a human touch, steady. He was breathing slow through his nose the way people breathe when they're counting. He pointed just once at the top of the steps, and it took me a second to see what he was seeing. A second shape, not in the flames, but farther back, where the shadow of the banyan made the trunk look thicker. In that darkness, something shifted, and an outline became a person, and the person became the outline again. I realized then that the fire wasn't just a warning to keep away. It made a screen. You look at light. You don't look at what light lets move behind it. We stayed still because fear is one thing, but stupidity is another. After a while, that was probably not more than a minute and felt like 10. The flame fell down on itself. The sound under the water ceased. The air where the figure had been looked ordinary again. A minute later, the shape by the tree lifted itself and stepped back into the lane on the far side. There was the soft scrape of a shoe on stone, and then nothing. The river moved on, pretending it had always been the only thing here. We waited. That's a detail I keep wanting to discard because I want myself to be brave and go. But we didn't. We waited. At 3:10, Bernard squeezed my sleeve once and stood slow. He nodded toward the gate. "Not now," I whispered, but he shook his head. "If we don't move now, we lose the trace," he said, and his voice was so normal that it woke something normal in me. And we went together, down the lane, past the place where the second person had stood. There was a smell there like burnt hair, like someone had singed a cloth too close to heat. We reached the gate and I unlooped the rope. The steps were colder than before. The stain at the water's edge looked thick. I kept my light low, close to my feet. By the third step, I felt that old hollowness. Bernard went to the wall and put his ear to it like you see in movies. He tapped with his knuckles. The sound came back dulled but not dead, as if something was in there with space around it. He set his hand in the gap where we'd found the loose mortar before, and this time the mortar moved like it had been oiled. He pulled, and a small section of stone came away. Behind it, in the lame light of my phone, we saw a metal canister the size of a kettle strapped into the recess. A thin tube ran down the inside of the wall and disappeared at a seam by the step. Another tube ran into the earth toward the river. The canister had a valve with a hand wheel and an improvised handle attached to the valve, a bit of wire tied to a string. The string ran through a tiny hole and headed toward the steps. It was cut clean. "We shouldn't touch this," Bernard said, and I nodded and realized I had already reached out and brushed the string with my fingers. It felt damp and smelled faintly of paraffin. We put the mortar back, because we didn't know who might be watching and because a stupid politeness rises in me in these moments, like closing the door you're about to run from. We went back to the top and looked around with our lights off. I felt watched. It's a childish phrase, but it holds. The night had that listening quality, like a person who has stopped smiling and is waiting to see what you do next. On the way back along the lane, we passed a scooter parked under a neem tree. The seat was damp with dew. The exhaust was still warm. A helmet hung from the handle. We didn't stop. At the bend near the temple wall, a man stepped out and stood in our path. He was short and had a wool cap pulled low. I recognized him only when he spoke. Nirmal. You could say my relief was huge, but it wasn't. It came as a small breath of something like disappointment in my throat and then a worse, colder thing. He didn't say hello. He didn't say my name. He said, "I told you not to go." His voice sounded like someone had wound it tighter. "I thought you were home," I said, because small talk is the floor I crawl onto when the room tilts. He looked past us at the gate. "People talk too much," he said. "People do the thinking of what other people know." He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. "You should go, girl. Finish your work and go back to your big city. Locks and keys are cleaner than the things that hide behind them." Then he turned and went the way we had come without a goodbye, like a man who had touched a pan by mistake and found it hot. Bernard and I watched him go. I wanted to call after him, to say we had put everything back, to tell him we hadn't told the police, but I didn't. I stood there and felt 10 different pieces of guilt fit together into a shape that looked a lot like shame. We parted at the crossroad. Bernard went toward his lodge. I told him to check in with me when he woke. He promised and held up 2 fingers in a light salute. I went back to the shop in a quiet that felt not empty but arranged. I double-locked the door and put a chair under the handle. Sleep wasn't possible, so I made tea. Then I didn't drink it because the taste had turned metallic in my mouth, like the time I bit my lip during a filling and tasted blood and metal mixed. In the morning, I told myself a story about being normal. I swept. I wrapped a string around bundles of blank receipt books. I made a list of things I would take back to the city. I went to get rid of a sack of rusted keys in the municipal scrap pile. On the way back, I saw the sub-inspector talking to a woman whose sari palu was pulled over her head to hide her face from sun and shame. He saw me and lifted his chin, not a greeting, more like a marker. I kept walking. Bernard didn't message. At noon, I went by the lodge, and the man at the desk told me he had checked out early. He left before breakfast, the man said, pointing a thumb at a register line he had himself scribbled. Said he got a call. No one ever truly believes that sentence, but you accept it because every person's life is a little beyond your reach. I told myself that was that, and I set a date to hand the shop keys back to the landlord. I packed my uncle's family photos in a tin trunk and tied a belt around it. I was tying the belt when I realized the trunk was the wrong weight. It was heavier than the photos, and the small book of wage notes could make it. I opened it. Between 2 stacks of sepia postcard prints wrapped in newspaper was a small camera I hadn't known my uncle owned. Plastic-bodied, cheap. Inside was an SD card tucked down with a twist of tape. I am not a person given to spying, but curiosity had already made a home in me, so I slid the card into my laptop. Most of it was the kind of thing an idle man with a small camera might collect. Face shots of people at the market he asked to take. Dogs, a kite. A child with his mouth dyed red from sweets doing a mock fierce face. The last folder was dated 3 months before my uncle died. Those pictures were all at the old GAT. They were taken at night. They were mostly bad. Motion blur and grain and the thing that happens when you try to capture a darkness that is bigger than the device in your hand. In 2 of them, you could see a faint stripe of flame and a smaller, brighter line underwater. In another, out of focus but solid, there was a hand on a valve and a ring of wire with a loop at the end. The last picture snapped something in me that had been pretending it would stay elastic. It showed the steps in that weird flat way phone cameras do when the flash hits stone too near. And on the top landing, it showed the shrine plinth, and beside it, the small slab we'd lifted. In the frame, mid-motion, head turned away, was Nirmal holding the slab. He wore a wool cap. His other hand was a blur on a coil of tube. That picture could mean 10 things. You can tell yourself 10 things very easily. He could have been moving the slab to clean litter. He could have been making sure boys hadn't opened the space. He could have been trying to stop something. He could have been doing what we had done, looking and then putting back. Except in the corner of the frame on the ground, there was a cheap alarm clock with its top off and its hand set to 3:00. And next to it, under a newspaper weight, a small battery with wires taped to it. And it is very hard to come up with the set of innocent reasons that leads to that. I printed one of the photos and put it in a brown envelope. I wrote sub-inspector on it and took it to the outpost. He wasn't there. A constable with a kind smile took it and told me he would pass it along. He didn't ask my father's name. I went back to the shop and sat until sunset, and then locked the shutters and went to Rena's and ate too much of whatever she put in front of me. When I walked back to the shop, the streetlight flickered once and came steady, and I felt that little childhood ache in my stomach I used to get when I'd lied about something small to my mother. I left the next morning. The bus ride was dull, and my seat partner was a man who chewed pan with his mouth closed, thank God. I kept falling asleep and waking with my head snapping back. I got to my apartment and set my bag on the table and lay on the floor because my bed looked too soft. I slept for 2 hours without dreaming and then woke to sudden, sure wakefulness that felt placed in me by someone else. I was certain that I could smell smoke. Not the neighbor's incense or the fried-on oil smell from the man who lives downstairs and cooks too much egg curry. Smoke like you get from ghee lit in a spoon. It was in my hair. It was in the sweater I'd worn. I stripped the sweater off and stuffed it in a bag and knotted it, and the smell thinned but didn't go. I scratched my palm where it had scraped and felt a tightness like a leather string drying, and when I looked, there was a faint shiny patch I hadn't noticed before that looked like it had been licked by a small flame. I told myself I'd brushed against the electric mosquito racket at Rena's. I turned every plug off. I opened the windows to December. At 9, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a riddle. It was 4 words, "You are very curious." I stared at it until the screen went dark. I didn't reply because the person who sends you that is not sending to start a conversation. I turned my phone off out of instinct and then turned it back on because what if someone needed me? Because that's how they get you. Later I told myself I'd imagined it, but the message was there in the morning. 3 days passed. I went to work. I answered emails. I told a watered-down version of everything to a friend who said all the right things and then suggested I see a movie. The sub-inspector did not call me. Bernard sent me one line on WhatsApp that said he was back home. Thanks for the tea, watch your step, and there was a tiny photograph of a river that wasn't ours. I washed my sweater and hung it in the winter sun and leaned down and smelled it when it was dry. It smelled like laundry powder, and something underneath it that the powder hadn't beaten. On the 4th day, I found the small alarm clock in my bag. It was the same make as the one in the photograph. It was the kind of thing you can buy at a shop on any corner. Red plastic, stiff switch on the back. It had no top and the hands were set to 3 auxiliary and the battery compartment was empty. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't, and there are not many times in your life you can say that with real confidence. The bag had been in my apartment the whole time. I took the clock to the sink like it was an insect I had to trap, and then realized what I was doing and laughed a little at myself because absurdity is almost as good as prayer. That night I slept badly. I kept hearing the sound under the water like a kettle sighing. At 3 exactly, the bulb in my kitchen soundlessly went out and then came on again. And I'm not a person who thinks the universe sends signals through wiring, but my stomach went cold and stayed cold. I got up and walked to the window and looked out at the apartment block across the way. A man 2 floors down was smoking near his sink, his face lit by his phone, his mouth making that tiny O around smoke that no one means to make. The city carried on. I carried on. A week later, because one thing begets another, I dreamed of the gat again and woke to the smell of lamp oil. When I went into my kitchen, the window over the sink was open. The latch had a small, clean scratch on it where metal had met metal. The sink was dry, but the steel drain strainer had a smear on it that was dark and glossy and smelled like the thing I had tried to forget. I wiped it with newspaper and threw it away, and then after a minute I went to the bin and took the crumpled paper back out and shoved it into a jar and shut the lid, because I don't like to pretend things didn't happen. I sat at the table and watched my own breath. I could end here in a way that makes me look reasonable. I could say I called the police and they told me, gently or with impatience, to stay away from local matters that weren't mine. I could say Nirmal suffered a small stroke a month later and moved to his nephews in Kandy. I could say Bernard messaged occasionally about rivers in other places and never came back. All this is true, but if I end there, I don't tell the part that keeps me from sleeping. It's small and it sounds like nothing, and maybe it is. Maybe it is nothing dressed as something by a mind that has been primed to notice angles where none exist. 2 weeks after I came back to the city, I went up on the roof at dusk with my mug of tea, because the light was that weak gold you get once a year if you're lucky. The water tank dripped, and the pigeons made that bitty strut they do. Across the street on the opposite roof, there's a man who dries chilies on a bedsheet and scolds children for playing cricket too close to his plants. He was not there. On his roof near the parapet stood a woman I have not seen before or since, wrapped in a dark shawl, her head covered properly, her hands tucked in. She had the stillness of someone standing very far away when they are not. She looked at the sky and then turned her face and looked at me. Not long, just enough that I knew she was not looking past me. Then she lowered her eyes to something at her feet. She bent slightly and the light caught a thin loop of wire in her hand before the shadow of the water tank ate it. I did not run downstairs. I did not call anyone. I stood there until the tea cooled, and the sky went from weak gold to the kind of gray that makes electric bulbs look jaundiced. When I finally moved, when I finally went down, I did it careful, like stepping around a sleeping animal. In the night, I woke once and my phone said 3 and I told myself not to get up, that I owed the dark nothing. In the morning, when I opened my door to fetch milk, there was a matchbox on my mat, the cheap kind that leaves sulfur on your fingers, and inside it was a small metal ring with threads, the sort that screws onto the end of a thin tube. It smelled faintly of the river. I changed the latch on my kitchen window and then I changed it again. I double-check the bolt on the door each night and I keep my keys on a hook I can see from my bed. Sometimes I think about my uncle, and whether he was curious like me or whether he was simply given something to hold and told not to drop it. Sometimes I think about Nirmal and the way he rubbed, his eyes like a man washing away grit, and wonder how many times. In his long, patient life, he did something for someone because it seemed small and then it wasn't. Sometimes I tell myself the shadow in the flame was a trick of heat, that the stillness was a posture of courage and not of instruction. Most nights I get away with it. Some nights I don't. There are places at the edges of towns where things gather because no one looks for them there. An old gat by a slow river is one of those places. A person tells a story, and the story keeps other people from asking questions, and a little rope on an iron gate becomes enough of a lock. When I think of that flame now, I don't imagine a ghost. I imagine a person who knows exactly what to do with a small clock and a length of tubing, and a story about a thing that will not die. I imagine them standing in it not because they must, but because it is useful that someone has seen a shadow, where no one has a name. I imagine their hands wet to the elbow, and a hood to catch the heat, and eyes already turned toward whatever waited behind that wall while you and I stared at light. Even writing this feels like standing too close. If you've lived near a river, you know how certain smells stay in your hair no matter what you wash with. And you know how sound travels in odd ways across water at night. That's all it is, I tell myself. Smell and sound, and someone who used what was at hand to make himself a story. You don't need an old god for that. People do fine on their own. The last time I went home in the early summer, Rena pressed a bag of mangoes into my hands and scolded me for staying away. We stood by her doorway, swatting ants off the threshold with a newspaper. She asked if I wanted to walk to the river. I said no without thinking, and then invented some errand to explain it. And she watched me with the resigned pity older women keep in a jar. When I left, I went the other way down the lane, past the temple and the grocer and the shop that sells cracked plastic buckets. I told myself I was grown, even now back in my apartment. When a bulb flickers at 3, when a match plays on TV, when a neighbor burns ghee for a puja and it spills over and licks the metal like a tongue, I think of that place and the loop of wire and the small clean scratch on my window latch and the way the flame rose as if it had been waiting for its cue. Sometimes, if I'm too tired to fight it, I go to the sink, turn on the tap, and let the water run until it goes very cold, because there is safety in hearing something move as it should. Then I switch the light off and lay back down and see, behind my eyes, the outline of a person who could be anyone, doing a thing that might be useful for a reason we never get to know, standing perfectly still inside a story he built, while the rest of us stay where we are supposed to, up on the lane watching a light we can explain and deciding, together, not to go down. I never thought I'd write this down, but the sounds still show up at 3 a.m. whether I'm ready or not. My name is Ruth Calder, and I live outside Pinedale, Wyoming, near a place most folks only know because they stop for gas on the way to the Wind River Range. I don't have grand stories. I teach 8th grade. I fold my grocery sacks so they stand up on their own. I keep my boots by the door, laces tucked inside each boot like a habit I learned from my dad. What happened last September on a solo hike was quiet and plain, in a way that feels worse than any campfire tale. I'm writing because the parts I can explain don't make the parts I can't any easier to carry, and I need to get it out of my head in the order it happened. My sister Hattie tried to talk me out of going by myself. She's a nurse in Jackson. She's practical and likes schedules, and she knows I get stubborn when the school year starts pressing on my ribs. "Just call me when you get back to your car," she said, twirling the phone cord at the nurse's station like she still had a landline. "Since your signal's going to drop as soon as you pass Boulder." "I'll text if I can," I said. I had my map folded along the creek drainage on the table and a thermos wrapped in a dish towel so my coffee wouldn't taste like detergent. "You always say that. You always forget." "I won't this time," she made me promise twice. I promised and meant it in that way you mean things when you are still at your kitchen table, and nothing is wrong yet. I left a note by the sink with my route written in block letters, because I read the missing hiker reports like everybody else does and over-prepare even when I'm trying to be casual. The sky was a dull bowl that morning. High clouds stretched thin like someone pulled a sheet tight. The last cattle trucks had rattled up the highway the week before, and the air smelled like dry grass and sunburned sagebrush. I parked at a pullout where the asphalt gave up pretending and turned to dirt. My plan was to hike 6 miles into a meadow I knew, camp under some spruces, then loop back along an old logging road that's more memory than road now. It was a Wednesday. I passed one other truck with a fly rod leaning against the tailgate and a styrofoam cooler dripping onto the dust. The driver nodded and I nodded back. I took a picture of my license plate and texted it to Hattie with the coordinates. The message spun and titled itself "Sent," 2 minutes later like it had to struggle through molasses. Good enough, I thought. I like the quiet right before the wind picks up, the way the trees seem to inhale as a group. The trail followed a creek that ran like someone whispering, A few miles in, there was a spur. I'd seen it on the map but never taken it, that led toward a symbol marked ruins. The word pulled at me in a childish way. I wanted to see what counted as ruins out here. I figured I'd look and then be back on the main trail by late afternoon. The spur was more of an idea than a path. Cow hoof prints, a couple of boot prints from someone with a longer stride than me, and deer tracks stitching between. It crossed a shallow draw and climbed a hill that smelled like wet pennies after a brief sprinkle started and ended in the same breath. The trees opened onto a clearing sunk into the slope like a thumbprint. At the center was what used to be a church, not a cathedral. Just an old clapboard rectangle with a steeple broken off and laid down like a stick on the grass. The windows were the kind that used to have colored panes, but now they were empty teeth. The door leaned into the doorway, not quite closed, like it had given up guarding anything. Behind it, the hill rose another 20 yards. There were stones back there, maybe 20, 30 of them, not uniform. Some homemade concrete with names scratched in before it set. Some river rock propped against bits of cedar plank. A handful with proper carved dates. I'd never heard of a church up there. I walked slow, feeling rude, though there wasn't anyone around to take offense. The first name I read was from 1915, Albertine Decker, letters shallow and shaky, like whoever carved them had never done it before. A few plots over, a small stone had daisies carved at the corners and the word baby, nothing else, which lifted and dropped something in me I didn't know was still so heavy. I told myself I'd eat lunch on the church steps and keep moving. The pews inside were gray with dust. There was a scar across the floor where someone had dragged out the stove a lifetime ago. A swallow nest had fallen and broken on the pulpit like a crown. It smelled like old paper, mouse droppings, rain that sneaks in around the frame. I sat on the top step with my back to the door and chewed jerky that went to powder in my mouth. I heard what I thought was a truck on a distant road, but then it was quiet again and I realized it was the wind rubbing the tops of aspens together. By late afternoon, clouds had thickened into something more resolute. I didn't like the idea of picking my way back to the main trail in the wet. I was carrying my small bivvy and a tarp, not a full tent. The spruces behind the church were dense enough to hold off the rain, and the ground there was soft with needles. It's against my better judgment to camp near an old building. People are drawn to buildings, and people bring trouble, but I'd seen no trash, no recent boot tracks around the door, only rabbit pellets and fallen twigs. I told myself I'd set up just far enough into the trees to be out of sight, but close enough to the clearing to enjoy the openness in the morning. I try to make my footprints look like deer when I sneak off the trail, though I'm not as good at it as I imagine. As I walked the tree line, I noticed a mound I hadn't registered before. Not by the stones, but off by itself where the spruces began, like a thought someone didn't want to finish. It was the size of a grave, there's no way around that description. The dirt was raw and damp. No grass had had time to start. If you've ever helped dig fence posts, you know the smell when you turn new earth. Dark, almost sweet, like a black loaf of bread. And this smelled like that, strong enough to make me swallow. There wasn't a headstone. There wasn't even a rock. The edges were clean and squared the way a backhoe leaves them when the operator knows what he's doing. You could see where the bucket teeth had raked the clay, tidy as a comb. I rubbed my palms together without thinking, to wipe off a feeling, though I hadn't touched anything. I told myself it was probably not as fresh as it looked. Rain can scour loose soil and make it look newly turned. It could be an old grave someone had tended. I crouched too long staring at it and then forced myself to look away. It was getting cold faster than the month promised. I chose a spot a short walk deeper into the trees where a pair of small spruces stood close enough together that I could string my tarp in a low lean-to. I laid down my ground cloth and put my bivvy on top, slid my pack into the foot of it to keep the mice out, and set my stove on a flat rock. The stove flame made that steady hiss I find comforting. I ate noodles from the pot with my hat pulled over my forehead and my headlamp off to save batteries. The rain came and went like someone indecisive. When the last light thinned out of the sky, I listened to it move through the needles, the occasional drip hitting my tarp like a finger flick. The thing about camping alone is your mind tries on noises like it's going to a costume party. A chipmunk becomes a person. The stove cooling becomes a footstep. I've practiced not giving out-of-place sounds too much attention, because if you feed them, they multiply. Still, at some point after I slid into my bivvy and zipped it to my chin, after the rain ebbed to mist, after the night birds settled into whatever they do until dawn, I became aware of a rhythm that wasn't quite wind and wasn't quite animal. It was soft enough that I thought I was hearing my own blood in my ears. A low, almost imperceptible up-down, like someone slowly pushing a pillow and letting it rise. I lay still with my fingers inside the edge of the zipper, feeling them go clammy. The sound, or movement, was coming from the direction of the clearing, not from the church, but from the edge, where the spruces started. I knew exactly where. I pushed my head out enough to see toward the darkest part of the dark. Everything was shapes. The silhouette of the church hunched at the top of the clearing, the lighter patch of the open sky, the darker patch where the trees crowded. My headlamp was around my wrist. The decision to turn it on felt consequential, the way deciding to look at a clock in the middle of the night feels dangerous, because the number will attach itself to you. I clicked the lamp on and kept the beam low to the ground out of habit, so I wouldn't blind myself. The light cut a strip through the needles and made the mist look solid. I could see 20 feet, maybe 30. Farther, the mound was a smudge. I killed the light again and told myself I was being dramatic. I tucked my mouth inside my sleeping bag and breathed the plastic smell. The up-down came again, and this time I recognized what made me think of breathing. It wasn't steady like a machine. It hesitated slightly at the top, the way a chest does. There are common-sense explanations for everything if you keep your feet on the ground. I told myself it could be rain pooling and seeping, air shifting in the soil as water filled pores. I told myself it could be a groundhog burrow collapsing and then resettling, though there aren't groundhogs here. Porcupine, fox? The rational thoughts relieved me for exactly as long as it took to realize how much I wanted them to be enough. I slid out of the bag, pushed my arms into my jacket sleeves, and tapped my headlamp to its lowest setting. The cold had a wet edge to it that made the bridge of my nose ache. I took 3 steps, then 6, then more because turning around felt worse than going forward. The needles muffled my footfall so well pressure itself made the loudest sound. The crackle of something giving way under my boot even when it was soft. I moved diagonally, not straight out, keeping a tree between me and the mound because I didn't like the idea of being seen. By what exactly I couldn't say. By the time I was close enough, there wasn't any doubt. In the projected oval of my lamp, the dirt lifted and fell. Not like a cartoon chest with exaggerated exaggeration. Barely. But the way when someone is trying to stay calm, they will breathe out almost all the way and stop just short, then slowly in through their nose because they don't want their throat to move. I watched the center of that rectangle do that. My mouth made a shape and no sound came out. Reason was still there. It said the obvious thing and I said it back to myself out loud, because saying it made it hold still. If there was a person in there. Then there wasn't time to think about whether or not you were going to look stupid or get in trouble with someone who claimed a deed to a dead church. You dig. You dig until you know you were wrong or right. I didn't have a shovel. My trowel was the size of a cereal spoon. I had my hands. I had a mess kit lid with a rolled edge. I started at the end nearest me, brushing aside the top layer that had already crusted. The soil underneath was damp and clumped. It stuck under my fingernails. It smelled like that black bread smell again, stronger now. After the first few handfuls, I cleared enough space that the rise and fall was less subtle. If you've ever watched someone sleeping under a blanket, barely breathing, eyes fluttering, the kind of sleep that looks like a negotiation with something, it looked like that. I realized I was whispering, "Hey, hey," like you do when someone is waking up from a bad dream, and then felt ridiculous because if someone was under there, they couldn't hear me unless I got to them. I tried to dig faster, and that made it worse. The hole I was making caved in. I used my mess kit lid like a spade and smacked a root, and my glove made a thud I felt in my palm. I took off my gloves because they were clumsy and then put them back on, because the cold made the skin across my knuckles feel split. I thought of Hattie learning CPR on a dummy and laughed once because the sound came out of me like a cough. I stopped and listened because I realized there was another sound I'd been ignoring. A dull tap that came every handful of seconds, not like wood against wood, distant, muted. A knock you'd make if you didn't want to call attention to yourself, I said. "I hear you," before I could help it. I slid my palm flat and leaned down. If you ever want to feel insane in a specific and measurable way, put your ear to dirt that behaves like a lung. It was so quiet what I heard I could have imagined it. A low hum, a patient sound, as if someone was counting in a language with no numbers. And that knock, 3, then a waiting, then 2. I have no idea what I thought that meant, but it felt like a message because my brain needed it to be. "Hang on," I said, because those were the words that came when you couldn't think of better ones. "Hang on, I didn't finish coming because that felt like a promise." I looked back at the church and thought of the pews. There might be a tool closet. There might be a spade left from some burial years ago. There might be nothing but mouse nests and hymnals. Leaving, even for 2 minutes, felt like stepping off a plank. Staying, clawing with my hands, felt like failing in slow motion. I sprinted across the clearing, headlamp bouncing. My beam picked up details I hadn't noticed by daylight. The way the paint on the door peeled in long curls like fingernails, the outline of the bell roped off and long gone. Inside, the air was a stale kind of cool. I went behind the pulpit and into a little room that must have been where they kept coffee and paper plates. The shelves were empty except for a cracked sugar jar and a bird skeleton that looked too lightweight to have been real. In the far corner was a broom and a snow shovel with a split scoop. I took the shovel because it was what I had. I heard an engine before I heard my own heartbeat slow. That's not fair. I heard the vibration before I realized it was an engine. It was far off, not on the spur, not on any road I'd driven. It blended with the sound of wind and distance before separating into something with pistons and timing. The shovel in my hand suddenly felt like an accusation. I stepped into the doorway as 2 headlights eased across the far edge of the clearing like yellow eyes. The vehicle was moving slow, too slow for a person just passing through. It turned into the clearing, tires soft on the grass, and braked in a careful way that told me the driver was familiar with this place. The headlights fell across the front of the church and then swiveled. Off as the engine died, I stood in the dark of the doorway and tried to think of a version of myself that was not a woman with a flat snow shovel at midnight near a fresh hole in the ground. A door squeaked and a beam of a flashlight cut through the mist like a pillar. Footsteps crunch, crunch, then a voice that was tired rather than suspicious. "Hello?" A man 50 maybe, not old but with old habits. Another set of footsteps on the other side of the vehicle. Maybe a second man. The first light pointed at the church door, and then, before it landed on me, I stepped out and said, "Hi, sorry, do you take care of this place?" The shovel clinked against the wood as my hand shook. The man in the lead wore a canvas jacket with the kind of wear pattern you only get from years of doing the same movement. His hair was close-cut and gray. A pencil was tucked behind his ear like it lived there. Beside him, a taller guy around my age wore a ball cap with a seed company logo. The older man angled his light down so it didn't hit me in the face. It was considerate. "Evening," he said. He glanced at the shovel and then back up at my face and did the math in a way that didn't end in a verdict right away. "You lost?" "No," I said. "I mean yes, but no. I was hiking. I found this." I set up just back there where the trees are thick and I was about to. I swallowed. "There's a grave. I think someone's in it." The sentence sounded like I'd learned English an hour ago. The taller guy shifted his weight and his light swept across his boots and back to me. The older man kept his still held low. He didn't say what? He didn't say, "Don't be ridiculous." He said where, I pointed. They walked in that direction like men who've already decided where they're going. I followed, and then sped up to get ahead because I didn't want their beams to be the first ones to land on it. When we reached the edge of the trees, the ground was a darker dark. I let my light find the rectangle. The soil rose and fell again, a small breath. I didn't have to sell anything. The older man put his hand flat on his chest, not from shock, but from a different feeling, something like resignation. He set his flashlight on the ground and knelt so he could touch the dirt with his palm. He kept it there and closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, he looked at me and said, "How long?" He meant how long had I been watching? Maybe 20 minutes, 40? "I don't know," I said. "I ran to the church and then I heard your truck." I realized how quiet I was, keeping my voice the way you do in hospitals and libraries, like the air itself is fragile. Do you have a shovel?" Or, the older man stood with the kind of patience it takes to stand up after years of bending in fields. "We don't touch graves at night," he said. And at first I took it for some superstition and felt anger begin to make me capable. He saw it and raised a hand. "Not because of ghosts. Because we make mistakes at night. You hit with a shovel wrong when you're in a hurry. You do a different kind of damage than the damage you came to stop. We'll call it in." "Call who?" I asked. "We're miles from—" "Deputy," the taller guy said. His voice was less careful than the older man's, smoother with something slippery under it. "Volunteer fire. We'll bring the backhoe from the shed. He raised his phone. No service here, he added, as if that were a neutral observation and not an obstacle with a person beneath it. Ray, we gotta get to the hill to get a bar. He meant a single bar of cell signal, I realized. Ray, the older man, nodded. I was on my knees by then. I can keep digging, I said. You call, please, Ray nodded again. You can keep clearing the top, he said. Just don't go deep. Don't collapse it if there's a cavity. Don't. He didn't finish, and in not finishing, he told me what he didn't want to say out loud about air and lack of it. He looked at me steadily. Don't put your ear right down there like you're in a movie. These can move sudden. It was a funny sentence until I felt the earth move, again against my hands like a cat shifting in a blanket. The taller guy jogged toward the truck and then stopped and came back and stood right on the edge of my light. You camped, you said? He asked me, as if that were the part he wanted to set in his notes. Back there, I said, chin flicking. He didn't look. He looked instead at the grave and then at Ray. We weren't supposed to be out here tonight, he said, which I think he meant as small talk, but which landed like an admission of scheduling. Ray ignored him or didn't hear. He moved to the truck with that deliberate not quite hurry. The taller guy went with him. The engine turned and faded as they drove up the hill toward where he'd said there might be a bar. The clearing got big and empty again in one breath. I knelt by the grave and scraped at the top layer, careful now not to cave anything. I timed my hands with the way the dirt rose, and there was a perverse relief that came with having something to do. I kept my mouth closed because my tongue felt too large. I counted to keep from listening too hard. 72, 73, 74. When I paused, the knock came again. 3 and then 2, and this time I did something I still can't justify. I knocked back, not on wood, but with my fingers on the packed edge. 2, then 3. I told myself it was stupid, but it was the only language in reach. The dirt rose. The dirt settled. The truck's lights reappeared like they'd been pushed up out of the earth. They parked farther this time, at the top of the clearing. Another set of lights crested behind them. Someone called someone who called someone else. A third smaller set. The second truck had a light bar that stayed off, then turned on once and then off as if to test that it worked. People stepped out and doors thunked. Shoes on grass. The murmuring cadence of men who work together and know when to talk quiet. 3 figures came down the slope. Ray in front. A deputy in a tan shirt with a dark line where a vest ended and the shirt began. And a thin man in a bright volunteer fireball cap with a chin that made him look younger than he probably was. Ray put his hand on my shoulder, in a way that was not unkind, and said, "We're going to take over now." He didn't mean it as an insult. He meant it like someone taking scissors away from a person holding the wrong end. "What's your name?" "Ruth," I said, called her. "I told your friend, this is Deputy Sloan," Ray said, nodding toward the man in the tan shirt. The deputy had the kind of face that can look sympathetic and blank at the same time. He took out a small spiral notebook, actually took it out, which seemed like a movie touch but was real. "And this is Mika," Ray said about the volunteer. Mika had nail polish on one thumb where the others were bare. I would have noticed it in daylight sooner. He nodded, serious and jumpy at the same time, like a dog trained to sit and being asked to wait extra long. "Ms. Calder," Deputy Sloan said, "you want to step back for me while they get started?" It was polite phrasing with a muscle in it. He was already stepping to place himself between me and the grave. "Not as a bodyguard, but as a wedge. I'm the one who—" I started, and then shut up because the sentence would have ended in something like "deserves," which felt foul in that place. Mika and Ray started with their hands like I had, until it was clear that wasn't going to be enough. "We need the backhoe," Mika said. And I had to look away because the word backhoe slotted too neatly next to where I'd been trying to keep careful human words. The taller guy, who I realized was a kid compared to me, maybe 22, jogged back up the hill toward the trucks. Deputy Sloan asked me the questions people always ask when they want to feel like there's a form to fit a situation into. What time did I arrive? Did I see any other vehicles? Did I notice any fresh tire tracks? Did I hear voices? Did I touch anything other than the dirt? "I touched the door of the church," I said, as if confessing to kindergarten mischief. "And the handle to the back room. And this shovel." He wrote everything down. His pen squeaked on the paper. He didn't ask me why I was out there by myself in the tone that expects an apology. He asked it like maybe he'd done it too when he was younger, and now had a list of stories about what could go wrong. The backhoe came down the slope like a dinosaur that doesn't belong to this geologic era. Its bucket was small enough to be precise. They positioned it with so much care it reminded me of a dentist chair. Mika handled the controls with a steadiness that made me respect him, and at the same time more afraid because men who are very good at digging have sometimes dug things they didn't want to talk about. The bucket teeth sank into the edge of the mound. Every time the dirt moved, the center rose and fell again, and I wondered in a practical way how the physics of that worked. If there was a cavity, and if their void was collapsing and rebuilding with every scoop, what was left to breathe? Ray stood off to the side with one hand planted on his hip like a handle. "Easy," he said, though Mika didn't need it. He looked over once at the deputy the way you look at a friend when you're doing the right thing and you hate it. The deputy held his radio up and spoke the kind of nonsense that's only not nonsense if you know the codes. Another vehicle arrived and parked up high. Nobody turned on a siren or any lights. I felt my knees at some point and had to sit. The grass was slick. The smell in the air changed the way it does before snow. Metallic even when there's no metal. They worked for what felt like an hour and what was probably less. They stopped at one point and everyone listened. The knock came once, then twice, and then not again. Ray closed his eyes the way he had at the beginning, and then opened them like a decision. "Okay," he said. "Okay." They dug the last foot by hand. The shovel in my hand felt heavier every time I didn't move. I struggled with the urge to go forward and with the equal urge to run as far and as hard as my legs would let me. When Ray said, "Here," it wasn't a triumph. The word was soft and almost ashamed. The dirt gave way to something that sounded different under their fingers, a duller sound than wood. "It's plastic," Mika said, and the way he said plastic made it a kind of swear. They cleared more. It wasn't a coffin. It was a tub, a construction-grade tote like you use for animal feed. Long as a man is tall if he draws his feet up. The lid was strapped with 2 ratchet straps, their handles bright, new. The straps had that switchback pattern of dust that shows where fingers have pulled them through. Ray's face did something I don't have words for. Mika reached for the nearest strap and Ray caught his wrist and said, "Wait." The deputy put a hand on his radio and then took it off. "We need," he began and then trailed. Nobody, whether out loud or in their heads, wanted to say what came next. Ray lifted the metal tab on the first strap and let the tension ease. The noise the strap made was not loud, but it sounded obscene in the same way as clapping in a church. The plastic lid lifted enough that air could move between it and the lip. There was a soft suck, not the movie kind, just a real-life sound of 2 surfaces parting. Ray put his fingers under the edge and paused, his eyes on the deputy's face like he needed permission or blame. The deputy nodded, which felt like I have to nod a go-ahead. They lifted the lid together. It's easy to say that what was inside was the worst thing I've ever seen, but that's not a fair contest when your life hasn't asked you to see many terrible things. I can tell you there was no blood. There was no cinematic horror. There was a woman, maybe my age, maybe a little older. Her hair was brown and wet. Her face was turned to the side the way a person turns to let a hairdresser rinse the soap line behind their ear. There was plastic under her head and gray felt under that. Her hands were tied loosely in front of her with a piece of clothesline that had stretched the way cotton stretches after being wet and dried. There was duct tape peeled up at one corner of her mouth like someone had let her talk and then changed their mind. Her chest rose and fell 3 more times as if to make a point, and then stopped rising as if the point had been made. Her eyes did not open. The breathing from the mound was over, and whatever breathing had been moving the dirt was part of a law of pressure and volume, and the last of something leaving, not entering. Nobody said a word for a measure of beats that fit inside my ribs and then leaked out like air from a balloon someone sits on. Ray said Mika, with a sound underneath his voice I had felt once in Hattie's kitchen when she took a pan out with her bare hand and realized it too late. Mika dropped to his knees and put 2 fingers under her jaw like he'd been taught. He glanced at the deputy, not for law but for witness. He started compressions, and the sound of his hands against that plastic rhythm was the sound that followed me home, and sat in the passenger seat and turned on my porch light for me. It was careful and determined, and it felt like 2 people counting and arguing and each one of them refusing to let the other go first. They worked without anyone saying stop for so long we had to live inside that moment like it was the only room in the world. When they did stop, it was because the deputy put his hand on Mika's shoulder and squeezed twice. And the squeeze said, "You did a thing," and also said you can stop doing the thing before it ruins you. Ray took the lid in both hands and laid it on the grass like it deserved respect for being a lid. He stood up slowly and the backhoe sat on its haunches, behind him like an animal that knows it has done everything it was built to do, and still, it was not enough. The deputy stepped back and put the heel of his hand against his brow and left it there. It looked theatrical and it wasn't. He called in words that would bring other people and he asked me, as if remembering, if I could show him where my camp was. He said it gently, but he put a comma of command into it and I found myself grateful for the shape of his sentence. I led him to my tarp, which looked embarrassing and small and domestic. He took out his phone and without trying took a picture of it, and then of my face in the beam of my own headlamp and then of my boots, because that was the procedure. He asked if I had anything illegal or dangerous in my pack like he'd ask anyone, and I said no, and he nodded but checked anyway. He said I could sit in the warm truck when they were done, or I could wait back at the church, or I could stay where I was. People like to give 3 options. It makes us feel like we're involved. I chose the church steps because the idea of sitting in a stranger's truck with my body plugged into the dashboard heater felt too intimate for my own skin. The air had that taste to it that means Dawn has decided to take the job seriously. The men moved in and out of the edge of my vision like parts of a clock doing their small, stubborn work. The lights from the trucks whitened the low mist and made it into a wall. At some point, an ambulance I hadn't heard arrive took the woman away. They didn't hurry. The speed of the walk tells the story. The difference between the short, quick steps of hope and the even glide of protocol. I kept my eyes on a knot in the wood of the step and followed the ring of it around and around with my fingertip. A person in a Uintah County coroner jacket came and went and took a statement and then took another, as if statements breed in the night. He asked me where I had touched again, and I said again, and he nodded like he was trying to be kind but had a quota. He looked very tired and had the sort of hair that stands up even when it is short. A second deputy showed up and stood with Deputy Sloan, and they looked at the church like 2 men. Look at a barn they keep meaning to fix and know they'll never fix. Ray's truck hummed without being on because the engine was warmer than the air. Mika sat on the tailgate and picked at a ragged bit of duct tape stuck to his palm, concentrating like it was homework and he didn't want to get it wrong. As daylight crept into the clearing and revealed the small humiliations of the place, the way the grass was crushed in rectangles where the ambulance had set its wheels, the muddied ruts by the lower edge, the lid of the tote leaning at an angle like the top of a cookie jar. Little pieces of the story began to assemble. Not the truth, just one of those stories the mind makes to give itself a place to set down. The backhoe wasn't there by accident. The tote didn't come from nowhere. The straps were new. Someone had money for straps and a place to be that made them feel like they had time to dig a hole. Someone had a key to a shed or bolt cutters. Someone knew there'd be 2 men who could be called and would come and would carry out a thing and quietly use words like procedure and chain of custody, because those are words that make a person feel like the floor will hold. Deputy Sloan walked me to my car in the full morning because he insisted, and also because it felt safer than being asked to drive alone right then. We didn't talk much on the way back to the highway. When we passed the part where the spur met the main trail, he said, "I don't mean this how it might sound, Ms. Calder, but it's best if you don't put this on the internet." I laughed in a short, mean burst that was the only laugh I could find. I started and then stopped because here I am. "I'm not interested in likes," I said, and he said, "I know." He did, I think. He took my information again and told me someone would be in touch. And they were once, 2 weeks later, to ask me to repeat the exact time I heard an engine the first time. I told the woman on the phone I didn't know, and she said, "That's okay." And I wanted to ask her how any of this was okay, but it was not her job to fix my sentences. Hattie came to my house and stood in my driveway with her scrub pants scrunched under her rain boots and hugged me so hard my shoulder made a sound. We cried in the silent, polite way we were taught, then ate cinnamon toast and talked about ordinary things until the toast was gone and we had no ordinary things left. 2 months later, a man I recognized from the gas station said in a voice that knows how this town works,
"Hear about that mess out by Trapper Creek?"
And I said no because I wasn't ready to entertain someone else's version, and he nodded like that was fair. I drove out on a sunny day that made even the derelict look sweet and parked at the same turnout and hiked the same trail, because doing it once is an accident and doing it twice proves to yourself that you aren't owned by a story. When I got to the clearing, the church looked more collapsed than before. The graveyard behind it seemed unchanged, which is ridiculous because nothing is unchanged in 2 months. The spot where the mound had been was smoother than it had any right to be. New grass had been laid down in neat squares like a quilt your grandmother finished by lamplight. If I hadn't known exactly where to stand with my toes on the same knot of root I'd seen in the dark, I would have missed it. A small flat stone had been set, not in line with the others but where the toe of the grave had been. No name, no date. The word peace carved into it with a Dremel and a shaky hand. I touched it. The rock was warmer than the air. I don't think that's mysterious. That part of the hill gets the morning sun. Still, I moved my hand away like I'd been burned. I stood with my arms crossed to pin them there and listened. Of course there was nothing, birds, a drip in the trees. Far away, maybe a truck on the highway. I thought of knocking. I thought of lying down on the grass and putting my ear where I knew the tote had been. I didn't. You learn. You learn that you can want information and also be unwilling to live with the information once you have it. On the way back, I passed a man coming the other direction. He had a camera around his neck, but his boots were new. He said, "Anything interesting up that way?" And I said, "Old church," and he nodded and said, "Cool," and kept moving. When I got to my car, there was a flyer tucked under the wiper blade for a local historical society talk on forgotten places of Sublet County, with a picture of a different ghost building on it. I put it on the passenger seat and then, at the first trash barrel at the next turnout, I threw it away. Not because I don't like history, but because I like it too much. And I didn't trust myself not to become one of the people who makes a hobby of other people's endings. Every so often, I'll see Ray buying Diesel or Mika at the co-op picking up a bag of salt. And if we make eye contact, our chins lift a tiny degree like birds recognizing birds. We don't talk about it. If I hear a backhoe in the distance, the hair on my neck stands up. Not because I'm superstitious, but because sound lives in the body longer than facts. I still fold my grocery bags and tuck my bootlaces into the boots. Hattie texts me twice as often as she used to when I go for a day hike. And I send her pictures of rocks that look like bread loaves and the trace of an elk's hooves in mud. I sleep most nights now, not all. Here's the part I haven't told anyone because it sounds either like nothing or like too much. On a windless night a few weeks after I went back, I woke at 3:07 a.m. and knew that number without looking because sometimes your bones tell you what the clock will say. In the quiet that lives in that time slot, there is a sound that becomes the room itself. My house has its habits. I know the refrigerator click, the furnace cough, the small sound the rafters make when the temperature drops suddenly. This sound was softer than any of those. An up-down, a patient climb and a reluctant return. I lay still and listened with a kind of cruelty toward myself. The sound receded the way sounds do when you chase them. I told myself it was plumbing, and then I got up and stood in the kitchen anyway with my hand flat on the counter. I could feel through the laminate a thrum that is in every house if you care to hunt for it. The hum of the grid, the stubborn hearts of appliances. But underneath that there was a rhythm, too slow to be mechanical, too steady to be wind. I pressed my ear to the cool synthetic surface and closed my eyes and held myself so still my breath got small. I heard the up and the down, and while my rational brain arranged pipes in plausible configurations, another part asked whether sounds can follow you home like the smell of smoke in your hair after a bonfire. In the morning, because I am the kind of fool who writes down what she hears like it will change anything, I knocked 3 and then 2 on the underside of my table. The silence after sounded not like it had swallowed a sound, but like it had chosen not to return one. I made coffee. I washed the mug right away instead of leaving it in the sink. I told Hattie later that day that we should plan a spring backpacking trip together, somewhere crowded and boring and safe. She said yes without asking why, because she knew, and some things you don't dig at after dark. The last thing I'll say is this. There's a difference between not knowing and not wanting to know, and only you can tell yourself which you are doing. People will tell you that closure is a thing you can buy if you have enough of the right kind of details. I think some doors close and you don't get to know who shut them from the other side. I think sometimes you stand next to a grave that looks like a chest and you feel it lift once and fall once, and everything after that is a kind of air moving from one space into another, taking the exact shape of each room as it goes, until without your permission it is inside your own walls, and you tell yourself it's just the house settling, and you tell yourself it's just the heat, and you tell yourself you're just breathing the way anyone breathes when they are trying to be quiet enough to hear whether the house is breathing back. I never thought I'd write this down, but I need it out of my head. My name is Beatrice Halcombe, and I live in a little rental behind the lumberyard in St. Anselm, Vermont, near the New Hampshire border. I'm 38, divorced, childless, and I have a boring job that should be safe from stories like this. I catalog old things. Churches call me when they clean out attics. Lawyers call me when a family dies and nobody knows what's worth saving. Sometimes historical societies hire me to digitize receipts from a century ago. People say antique appraiser because it sounds nicer than the lady who picks through mouse nests. I'm not a ghost hunter. I'm not even very imaginative. But I was the one who stayed the night in the old children's burial ground because a podcaster wanted a skeptic. And I needed the money. I'm telling it now because there's chalk under my bedroom window again. It rained last night. You can still see the smear where a small hand slid down the clapboard. It's the third time in 6 weeks. I don't scare easily, not normally. I can sleep anywhere, eat gas station food, and drive at night with a windshield full of moths. But I haven't slept properly since April. This started when my neighbor, a high school math teacher named Graham with a tidy mustache and a habit of mowing at sunrise, forwarded a Facebook event to our Little Blocks group. Local history talk at the library, he wrote. Kids a cemetery. Spooky season. The photo showed a skipping rope on a stone. That got under my skin. The rope looked too clean. St. Anselm's library is one of those brick boxes with a Mansfield furnace that hisses like it's angry. The event wasn't much. A young librarian with a headband rattled off facts from a yellow binder. There was a burial ground in the next town over, Havens Brook, for children who died at the old sanatorium in the 1910s. Scarlet fever, diphtheria, measles. Their families were poor. Some were immigrants, some bodies went unclaimed for too long. The sanatorium handled it. A little fenced plot, 15 stones, all the same size. The state closed the sanatorium and the county let the fence rot. Kids broke bottles there. Teenagers smoked. The librarian lowered her voice in a way that was meant to be fun. People say you can hear a girl giggle if you go after midnight. Boy behind me whispered that his cousin dared a friend to sleep over the wall and he woke up with a marble in his pocket that he didn't put there. I rolled my eyes. I also made a note. The sanatorium had kept receipts. That's the kind of thing I do. I told the librarian if she found ledgers, I'd help catalog them pro bono. She seemed relieved anyone offered something that wasn't a story. 3 days later, I got a message request I almost ignored. Hi, B. My name is Lyle. I host the podcast Near Dark. Do you do on-site assessments? I pay. His profile picture showed a man with carefully messy hair and a sweatshirt that probably cost more than my breaks. He wrote, Our next episode is the Havens Brook Children's Cemetery. We need a grounded voice. Are you up for an overnight? We'll be respectful, no Ouija, no trespassing. We've got permission. I called him because you learn quickly to hear a voice before you say yes. He sounded practiced and cheerful. He said the sheriff's office knew they'd be there. He said the groundskeeper was fine with it. He said he wanted me to hold us to reality. They offered $500 and my name in the credits. My car needed tires, so I said yes. My brother Raymond heard about it because everything travels through our mother. He called me while I was buying batteries. Ray has a hardware store in Rutland and the same protective streak he had when we were kids, like, I'm still the little sister falling off hay bales. He thinks content creators are a scam. He said, don't go alone in the woods with some guy who records fear for a living. I told him there'd be a producer and a sound engineer and maybe a student volunteer. He said bring a knife. I told him knives are illegal on state land after dusk. I bought pepper spray in his store anyway and didn't mention it. Havens Brook is 2 towns over, more fields than businesses. I drove past a feed store with a crooked silo, a church with white aluminum siding, a diner with a sign that said pie like it was a command. The old sanatorium is a rectangle of white buildings halfway up a hill. Now studios for potters and a yoga guy with a man bun. The burial ground is in the scrub at the bottom of the hill near a brook that gurgles even when it doesn't look like there's enough water. You can smell iron in it. I parked on the gravel near a rusted gate and saw 2 men wave. The cheerful one was Lyle. The other was a sound guy with a beard like a bear pelt. He was introduced as Tom. A woman sat on the tailgate of a Subaru with a clipboard, dark lipstick, and a fleece vest embroidered with their logo. Marjorie, she said, shaking my hand with knuckles so cold they stung. I handle releases and sheriffs. A 4th person, a college kid in an orange hat, raised a thermos and said, I'm Finn. I do B-roll. Nothing about them screamed serial killer. They had granola and first aid, and a printed permission letter from the county. The groundskeeper, they said, was named Carl, and would do a check-in around dusk and another near dawn. We promised we wouldn't trample, Marjorie said, angling my phone at the QR code on her clipboard. Please don't post locations. I don't have many followers, but I nodded like someone who did. The plot wasn't big. The stones were all the same size, pale and lichen soft. The names were plain: Elsa, Ruth, Michael, Anna, and the dates were crushed together, 1911 through 1915 mostly, with one 1917 that made me think of influenza. There were pebbles on some stones, pine cones on others, a cracked plastic bracelet on one that made my throat tight. The air was mud cold and smelled like leaves, sweet and sour. The brook made a glassy clucking sound. We set up just outside the low iron fence that had been replaced recently, black paint still neat. They had solar lanterns and a little camping table with a plaid cloth and snacks. Tom set 2 microphones on short stands and clipped a tiny one onto my jacket with a warm, heavy hand. "Talk like you're at a kitchen table," he said. "Don't change volume for us, we'll ride the levels." Lyle wanted me to walk the perimeter with him and talk about the markers like I knew them. I told the truth. The sanatorium had been county-run, which meant records were somewhere in a basement, and sometimes poor people's names were spelled wrong. A girl could be Anna on one line and Annie on the next if a clerk was tired. Lyle liked that. He liked when I said superstition came from real fears you could name. He nodded with his whole body whenever I told him something grounded. Carl, the groundskeeper, came at dusk in a blue county truck, 2 yellow flashers clicking on top like slow eyes. He was older than my father, in a quilted jacket with a frayed collar and a cap that said case in cracked white letters. He had a pencil behind his ear, the kind a man like that could sleep in. He said he had a dog but left her home after some teen ran screaming last fall. "People spook around kids," he said quietly, not looking at the stones. "It isn't right." He signed Marjorie's sheet with a blocky signature and looked at the microphones like they were mice. "You'll pack it all up when you're done," he said, which wasn't a question. He told us deputies would drive by twice on their loop. "Don't chase anything into the trees. There's an old well. When it was fully dark, the temperature fell hard, the kind of cold that bites your thumb joints. The lanterns made small bowls of light and everything else was the color of coffee. Finn went around taking pictures with no flash and then sat cross-legged, his orange hat a little moon. Lyle did his intro twice, smoothing out words. He had a radio voice when he turned it on. He talked about grief. He mentioned a rumor about giggling that teens in town liked to repeat. He said in a tone I recognized from late-night stations, "We're not here to prove anything. We're here to listen." We listened for 2 hours. Tom gave us hand warmers when our breaths looked like smoke from chimneys. We talked about measles. I said my grandmother had a little sister who died in 3 days, and they put the sheets in a barrel to burn. I said, reaching into that story still made my grandmother quiet. Lyle asked in that low radio way, "And if there is anything here, we mean no harm." He had me say it too. My mouth tasted like old pennies. The brook kept clucking. Around 11, a car idled on the road and headlights slowed across the trees. The lights didn't turn in, they moved on. Tom made a note of the time. He carried a small spiral notebook with patient handwriting, not the messy scrawl I expected. He wrote down insulation words: owl, truck, wind. Lyle told us to stretch. He did a jumping jack and looked embarrassed, then laughed, beat the cold out of his arms with his hands. At midnight, he said, "Let's do the thing." He meant he wanted to try a story all the other shows do. One person sits in the dark alone, inside a boundary while the others keep watch just out of sight, recording everything. "Estes, but not really," Tom muttered. "No headphones." Lyle looked at me. "Would you be comfortable?" The truth is, I was, at least at the time. People had been here grief-hard before me. All I'd be doing was sitting among names. I said I'd do it if I could choose where. I picked the cornerstone with the plastic bracelet because the broken circle meant someone had come here not for TikTok, but because they needed to touch something. The plastic was cloudy, like it had been in a pocket with lint for years. Tom handed me a walkie. He clipped the tiny mic higher on my collar. He gave me another hand warmer, then another. "Tap the antenna twice if you need us," he said, and his voice was the kind you'd trust to help you off ice. They turned off the bigger lanterns and moved back to the table. The brook got louder when there wasn't any other sound. The dark in a cold field is a living thing. It settles in layers. There was the black tight to my face, then another where a branch twitched, then another where nothing moved at all. The sky was cloud, no moon. I could smell the iron in the water and the mold in the leaves and a sharper smell, like old rope or mildewed canvas. My eyes invented shapes and then uninvented them. My mother used to say that if you just breathe, your fear goes in and out like a tide, so I breathed. Around 1, the first laugh came. It wasn't a giggle. It was a sound made small. I know kids. I babysat all through college. They don't laugh like that. This was more like someone exhaling and then letting the end of it turn up, a sound made tiny on purpose. It came from the trees, maybe 20 yards beyond the fence. I pressed the walkie to my mouth and said so. Tom's voice came, breath quiet. Copy. A pause. Could be a fox. They bark like weird babies. Another pause. Stay put. Something touched my boot. My throat went up my neck, but it was only a maple leaf stuck by the wet. I told myself facts. Foxes scream, deer huff, owls click their tongues. I told myself kids tell camp stories that hand down like quilts. Then I saw it. Not any shape I want to invent for you. Just height and motion, knee-high and quick. A grayness that slid fast between the stones inside the fence. Not beyond it. Inside. I tasted copper and plastic hand-warmer salt. I heard the smallest shoe scrape on granite. I felt my mouth move and not make sound. I pressed the walkie so hard the antenna hurt my palm. There's someone in here, I said, and my breath fogged the word. Inside. Tom said, copy, and something in his voice was suddenly all wire. The rustle from the table changed. I heard a zipper. I heard Marjorie whisper the word deputy. The grayness went behind the next stone and then the next. It moved like a kid playing tag. I'm not proud of what I did next. I said, hey, but not the way you'd call a child. I said it like you'd tell a dog to drop something. The figure stopped by the bracelet stone and rose a little taller as if it straightened, and then I heard the words, close enough that I felt the air of them but so soft they slid over the bottom of sound. Play with me. Forever. I have told myself where those words could come from. A recording hidden, a Bluetooth speaker, a voice box from a doll, a teenage girl's high whisper through her hands. I know all these things. It did not help that the breath that pushed them smelled like wintergreen. Do not move, Tom said in my ear, and his voice did not ride levels anymore, it cracked. Lyle said, I'm calling out. Then louder from the table, we have permission to be here. If you're a person, we don't want trouble. It was the line all of them used, and it sounded suddenly like children playing at soldiers. The grayness didn't move. The shape by the stone felt like an idea more than a body, but I could make out the darker notch where a head would be. If you've ever been so frightened your knees shake, you know it's stupid. Your legs do that even if you're crouched. The walkie thumped my chest. The second laugh came from behind me where the fence met the trees. That's when I knew there was more than one. My mouth filled with that old penny taste, and I stood up without meaning to. The grayness didn't flinch at the movement, which somehow made it worse. Between the trees, a little flash of reflective tape slid, something like what they put on kids' sneakers. The smell of wintergreen got stronger, like somebody had unwrapped gum or chest rub. It got under the iron stink of the brook, under the leaves. My eyes watered. I turned my head slow. I said, if this is a real child, I have Coco, which was absurd, but mothers use that coaxing voice on dogs, on cats. Everything in me knew there wasn't Coco in the cooler. I don't know why I thought saying it would make anything human answer. What answered instead was a very soft scrape, like chalk on stone. It came from the base of the bracelet marker. My flashlight lay in my pocket the whole time because Lyle had told us no lights until needed, to protect night vision. I pulled it out with hands that didn't feel attached to me and thumbed it on. The beam jerked. No child exploded from the brightness. No monster either. The grayness was a coat. A child-sized wool coat the color of the old sanatorium buildings, draped on a T-shaped stick. The stick had chicken wire stuffed under it to make shoulders. The coat's sleeves hung toward the ground and its cuffs were shredded as if by teeth. A hat sat on top, a round, soft thing with a brim, the kind in photographs from 1910. There were no eyes, nothing like a face. But the hat had a white strip, stitched around the base that would flash in headlights or moon. At the foot of the stone, a small hand moved. Not a ghost's. A real hand, a child's. The nails bitten down, dirt under them, a smear of white chalk on the thumb. It was attached to a kid lying flat on her stomach in the wet leaves, holding a piece of chalk she'd been dragging lightly along the granite. Every story wants a clean line after a reveal. Mine doesn't have one. Time got sideways. The kid flinched from the light but did not run. She had a knit cap yanked low and a coat with patches on the elbows. She smelled like wintergreen gum and damp. The chalk squeaked once and the coat on the stick swayed from the draft of my flashlight hand. "Hey," I said again. This time the way you would to a child you find where they shouldn't be. "Sweetheart." She looked at me sideways, and then she did possibly the oddest thing she could have done. She put the chalk in her mouth, chewed it twice like sugar, and swallowed and smiled with a powdery film on her lips. And in the same second, there was motion behind the fence. Quick, lower to the ground, but long. Not a person. That time was a fox, or a dog, something alive, slick with the smell of damp fur. It ran left and my beam jerked with it and I lost the child in the light. Tom's boots thudded on the frozen grass. He came through the opening in the fence and the sound was so astonishing in the quiet that the kid sprang up as if a puppet string had yanked her. She bolted not out the fence but deeper among the stones, then hopped the iron with an easiness I don't have in a body like mine, and went straight for the dark, crunchy underbrush where the brook started to sound like a throat clearing. "No," I said. Not stop, which is how you talk to dogs, but no, which is how you plead with children, and Tom, bless him, didn't chase. He stopped like Law had told him to, rest his hand on the fence like he was touching a hot stove. "We can't go in," he said. "Liability," he called. "Hey, you all right?" The way a man calls to someone who might pull him over 80 feet of old well. We never saw her face properly. We saw a light patch under the hat where a cheek would be. We saw a knit tassel blue. We heard the wintergreen at the same time again, sweet and sharp. We heard the smallest laugh, but this time it wasn't hidden. It was the leftover air in her throat as she ran and swallowed chalk. A second person moved in the trees. This, I think, was an adult. Not by height, I couldn't see height, but by sound. Adults don't break twigs the same as kids. We get cautious in our ankles. We place our weight differently. The person moved from between two firs to a darker stand of hemlock, like they were part of the place. The hair on my arms lifted. I angled the beam and caught something white just above the ground. A strip of cloth tied around the base of a sapling. Another strip 5 steps farther, not reflective but chalk-dusted. There were more, a trail. If I had been telling this story to Lyle with comfort between us and a cup of cocoa, I might have said breadcrumbs. In the real time of that field, it was more like something you leave your dog to find home. "Who's there?" Lyle called, and his voice cracked on who. We're leaving if we need to." Then a man's voice came from the trees and did the oddest thing it could do. It laughed too. Not kindly, not mocking. Just a line of air with the end of it kinked up like the line a kid draws as a smile because a teacher told them that's how a face goes. The laugh was quiet and neat and stopped in the middle like it had been pinched. I don't remember herself making the decision, but my body moved between the fence and that sound and my mouth said, "Do you need help?" And where's your mom? Because where else do children come from at 1 in the morning in a muddy plot? But mothers, even if that's a story, even if the person I wanted to exist in those trees had never existed there. The chalk girl had already vanished into brush that looked like it could swallow small legs and spit out cold. Marjorie hissed my name like a rope, like she could pull me back with it. "Beatrice," she said, and it's odd. I always thought my name sounded too soft to be serious, but it cut through me like a doctor says, "Enough." A flashlight beam swung from the road then, and we heard the county deputy's Tahoe tires on gravel. Relief is a chemical flood that makes you feel briefly drunk. The beam played over the fence and we all turned like flowers. By the time the deputy, a woman with a braid and sensible boots, got out and said, "Everything okay, folks?" The trees were only trees. We told her what we had seen. We told her we stayed out of the fenced area. She nodded with the patience of someone who breaks up rumors between 12-year-olds all day. She said there had been reports of people leaving candles lately. She said she'd walk the perimeter. She asked if we'd seen any vehicle pull off farther down. We told her about the idle headlights an hour before. She made a note. The braid swung. Her name tag said G. Lemieux. It struck me then that she was younger than me by a decade, and I wanted 10 strong women with flashlights, not one practical person with a radio that scratched when she pressed it. She did the loop once with an even step. The only time she stopped was to pick up a broken beer bottle and set it gently on a flat stone. "Don't cut a fox," she said, half to herself. When she finished, she told us she'd had a pass around 2 a.m. and left us in that sound again. The brook clucking, my own breath loud to me. I didn't do the alone set again. I stood by the table with my hands under my arms, and Lyle didn't ask. Tom wrapped the third hand warmer in a paper towel so it didn't frostbite my fingers. "We're done after one more," he said. He asked me about how poor families grieved when a child died in a place like this. I told him about hair brooches and tin types, the way people snipped locks and tucked them into Bibles, how names echoed because people couldn't bear to forget. I told him about chalk. I remembered my grandmother, how she would break chalk and chew it when she was pregnant, like her body craved the calcium and would take it any way she could. I don't know why that came out of my mouth then, except the kid with the chalk in her teeth. We didn't get any more sounds like laughter. We wrapped by 2:30. Carl came at dawn with steam off his coffee and didn't say a word. His eyes took in the prints and the dragged arc of chalk like he was memorizing them the way a shepherd counts sheep. Before I left, I knelt by the bracelet stone. The chalk line was a whisper across the base, not a word, just a light fish belly mark. Something sat on the top like an offering, not a marble. A doll's eye, the kind they used to have in composition dolls. Glass with a sliver of wire still stuck to its back where it would have hinged open and shut. It glinted. I didn't touch it. We sent our files to Marjorie to be released with the episode. I told her to bleep my cursing when the grayness first moved, because I didn't remember swearing, but I must have. She laughed automatically and then didn't. A week passed. The episode aired. They cut it so it sounded like the laugh came from nowhere at all, and I understand why. I've learned how to shape stories too. They left in my measured skepticism because it made Lyle's voice feel braver. The comments were full of people who love to be spooked and people who think speakers hide in trees. Someone posted a map that wasn't exactly the right spot, but enough to send kids to the wrong trail. I begged Marjorie to take it down. She tried. It floated. The chalk smear under my bedroom window appeared 2 days later. At first I thought it was the lumberyard kids. They cut through our backlot sometimes to get to the basketball hoop at the volunteer fire station. They're good kids. They leave apple cores on my stoop like gifts. The smear was a small hand, dragging down like someone was trying to look in. I stood on my little step stool with a rag and felt more angry than frightened. Then I smelled wintergreen and sat down on the stool hard enough that my tailbone complained. A neighbor's dryer vent puffed warm lint smell. Somebody's wind chimes ticked weakly in a fitful breeze. I wiped the handprint away and chalk dust turned the rag a pale sky color and left grit under my nails. I slept on the couch that night so I could see the window with my feet. 2 mornings later, a marble rolled out from under my coffee table when I turned on the heat, and the vent's air pushed dust. It was smoky glass with a swirl like something trapped in ice. "I don't own marbles." I called Ray. He didn't laugh. He didn't say prank. He said, "I'm coming." I told him not to. I told him he'd miss inventory. He came anyway. He sat on the couch, knees apart, holding the marble on his palm like a bird's egg. His mouth moved around words he wasn't going to say. We walked around my little yard. He pointed at the ground by the back fence where leaves were scuffed. "Fox," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. He bought me a motion light and installed it under the window while I made grilled cheese like we were both 10. The light went off twice that week at 2 in the morning. I looked out and saw a raccoon once, glossy as a tire, its ringed tail flicking. The other time I saw nothing. In the morning there was a bit of white tied around the chain link. It was a strip of cloth like the ones in the woods. Chalk dust made my finger pale when I touched it. Under it, Tucked in the fence's diamond was a postcard of the sanatorium from 100 years ago. It had been cut from a book. The corners were ragged where someone hurried with scissors. On the back, penciled lightly in the smallest, neatest hand, was a single word: stay. I kept telling myself a teenager did it. Maybe that college kid Finn who liked a story more than a grade. Maybe a jealous rival podcaster who thought this would make us do a follow-up. The smell of wintergreen in the water made cold and the quick way that child moved between stones were both too particular for a teenager to conjure across town. But I kept telling myself anyway. I did what people do when they want to believe they control something. I put up a low camera under the eave, the kind you can check on your phone. I told myself I wouldn't look in bed just in the morning. I looked in bed. The first 3 nights, nothing but a raccoon, an opossum, Graham's cat named Chairman Meow. On the 4th, rain ticked at the edges of the picture and made the sensor fuzz like TV snow. At 2:22, a shadow crossed the window, a small one, a head height that would match the chalk hand, and something flashed just a little, like a stitched reflective strip. I sat up so fast the covers slid. The camera's mic picked up the gentle chuff of the rain and a small sound that could have been a laugh or a cough. Then the window. My bedroom window, where I have lined up 3 snow globes from towns I'd rather live in, creaked a fractional creak, like a hand drew a finger under it testing weather strip. The chalk smear bloomed a slow white and then dragged the way it had before down. The small hand lifted off and left behind the faintest shape of 5. The camera made its statistics, pixelated it into squares. I watched the squares deposit themselves in a way my brain knew meant fingers. I got up. I am not stupid. But there's a stupid bravery that belongs to people who have decided they are the main character in their one life, and I had that kind. I didn't open the window. I didn't scream into it either. I moved to the back door with the chain and the deadbolt and set my hand on both and didn't touch them. I flicked the switch for the motion light. Cold white flooded the yard. Nothing stood there. The chain link glowed like piano teeth. The strip of cloth I had untied was gone, or wet enough to be clear. The rain smelled like aluminum. When I went back to the bedroom, my snow globes stood in their row and inside the one of Lake George. Fake flakes rested on a plastic ferry boat like they always did, except the ferry was turned to face me. It had faced left for years, and that meant I didn't have to look at it. Now it faced right. That's the kind of detail you don't notice because you don't need to until you do. I left a voicemail for Deputy Lemieux. I told her I didn't expect an emergency response. I told her this could be a prank by fans. She called back in the morning and said they could do a drive-by more often this week. No guarantees. She never said the phrase creepy podcast listeners, but it was in the vowels. She said to keep the camera footage. She said maybe avoid posting about it. I hadn't posted at all. The only person I told was Ray. He texted, "Get a dog. I can barely keep a cactus." I texted back, "Maybe I'll get a cactus with teeth." Then the envelope came. It was stuck between my screen door and my door like junk menus get stuck. No stamp, just my name written in perfect tiny pencil. Inside was a folded paper towel. Inside that, wrapped like something breakable, was a little waterproof recorder, the kind birders use. It was old but good. I sat on the cushion that sags because I always sit there, and I pressed play. Wind, leaves, the brooks clucking. My own voice from that night saying, "If this is a real child, I have Coco." Then that breath laugh and the small voice. Mine and not mine. In my house the way a mosquito whines in a room. Play with me, forever. It is one thing to have heard those words in the cold when your hands stung. It is another to hear them while the kettle clicks and the neighbor's kids ride by, and someone down the block uses a leaf blower for no reason. I took the recorder to the sheriff's office. The person at the window was a woman, maybe 60, who knew my name because of Ray, or because of Facebook, or because we all lived too close to each other. She listened with her lips pressed flat and said she'd give it to G. Lemieux. She asked if the envelope would have fingerprints. I told her I already smudged my own all over it because I never think that way first. She touched my hand through the glass like a mother in a movie and said, "You did fine." That night I slept in Ray's guest room on a bed that squeaked. It smelled like cedar. His wife had put a quilt on it with stars and geese like an ant would. I dreamt I was sitting in the cemetery and the stones were taller than me, and the brook said my name in the clucking way it has. In the morning, Ray made eggs and said, "Stay another night," and I would have. But the pile of things I'm supposed to scan grows like grass, and the library pays $40 an hour, and I am a person who honors schedules like talismans. I went home. On my doormat was a little pile of chalk, wrapped gently in plastic wrap to keep it dry. I stopped opening my windows, even when the air smelled like apples and everybody else had their screens in. I learned the names on the stones better than I know my cousin's kids. I went to the county records basement and ran my fingers along spines, until I found a ledger with penciled numbers, and one row with 2 names squeezed in because the clerk had tried to keep the hand the same, but the child was too much to put in the space they had made. Elsa and Elsa. The same girl spelled 2 ways a week apart because her mother must have said it quietly, and the clerk didn't ask twice. I stood in that basement where a dehumidifier hummed, and I cried one of those small, efficient cries people do in public places where there are no tissues. When I got home, there was a chalk drawing on my back step. A hopscotch grid. The numbers weren't numbers, I know. They were little lines and dots like tallies. 7 in the first square, then 5, then 3. There wasn't a stone to throw. I stood with my keys in my fist and my palms sweated. I stepped over it into my kitchen and my shoe squeaked on linoleum. And I said out loud to the empty house, "No." Here's the part someone will say I invented because on shows like Lyle's, this is where a twist goes. Deputy Lemieux came by on a Tuesday at 4 in a light rain and said a man in the next county over had been questioned about trespassing at the sanatorium. He'd been seen near the artist studios with a child. He said she was his niece. He had a newish van with no rear windows and those choose-your-own decals on the back that people use to show their family members as stick figures. His had a mother missing, just him, a dad, and a girl. The van had a dent near the taillight. Someone wrote down the plate wrong. The artist who saw him couldn't tell if it was Vermont or New Hampshire. "We're not alarmed," she said, meaning she was. "We're aware." She asked if I would go through the kids' missing posters online to see if anyone looked like the girl. I said yes and lasted 2 pages before I felt like I had been dipping my hands in a river I couldn't cross. I closed my laptop and sat with my face in my palms until my sinuses hurt. Night by night, the things came small and ordinary. A mitten with a loop that you're supposed to attach to a coat sleeve appeared on my fence. It was woolen matted and too small for a teenager. The smell of wintergreen sometimes hit before I heard anything. Chalk marks on my trash bin. Once, a little paper cup from the diner, crumpled, with a circle of pink lip balm at the rim that made me think of the library girl's headband, even though that was silly. I took photos of everything for the deputy, and then I threw most of it away because the idea of collecting it felt like accepting terms I didn't understand. I stopped walking in the cemetery. I never went back. Lyle messaged to ask if I would do a follow-up episode. He wrote, "Only if you want." He wrote, "If there's more." I didn't answer. He sent a string of apology emojis that looked like prayer. Tom sent a single line, "We stayed honest, right?" I liked that he had asked that question, that it mattered to him. I told him yes. It had been honest. That didn't make it okay. 2 weeks ago, the chalk grease print under the window came back after a lull when I had thought it was over. The hand was smeared like rain had taken its time pulling each finger down. That's when the smell changed. Not just wintergreen, something under it. Fipo rub, the old-fashioned kind in blue jars that mothers rub on chests. Old wool, wet long enough it gets sweet and then sharp. A small sour milk note. I put my hand to the pane and felt cold like my palm had touched a coin. Kids try windows out of curiosity. People who aren't kids do it to learn something. The handprint was higher than before by an inch. I told Ray I was going to stay with our mother in Bennington for a while, and he said, "We'll change your locks first." He came with a drill and a new knob while I wrapped the doll eye in a napkin and put it in the very back of a drawer like you put a photograph you're trying not to look at but need in the house to know you're still the kind of person who keeps evidence. Ray took the old lock off and set it on the counter and said, "Somebody oiled this." "You didn't, did you?" The key moved too smoothly. He shook the lock in his hand and it rattled like there was grit inside. Chalk. Maybe. I don't know. We changed it. I slept elsewhere that night and the next. When I came back for more clothes, a trail of white strips had been tied low along my chain link again, leading not away but toward my back steps, toward my door. They were tied in tidy square knots like someone had learned them from a book. The last strip was tucked under my doormat. I didn't lift it. I stepped around it inside. I turned the lamp on, Then off because the light made me feel too watched. Then on because the dark made me feel worse. I put my bag down and the house made its settling noises. The tiny snap of wood, the refrigerator's faraway click. And then another sound, very soft, inside the kitchen wall. A fingertip running along a seam of plaster. I listened. The sound went down, then up like someone traced a hopscotch in the wrong direction. I stood with my hand on the counter. I knew mice make scuttles, squirrels make scrapes, raccoons make clever hands. This was none of those. This was the sound my finger made on my classroom chalkboard in 1991, when my teacher made me erase the numbers I had rushed. I moved so slowly that if someone had filmed me, it would look like a time-lapse in reverse. I walked to the drawer where I had put the doll eye. I slid it open. The napkin was there. It had been unwrapped and rewrapped. The eye was turned the other way. The little wire hook on its back had been bent to a sharper angle. You could hang it now. I have not told you any ending yet because nothing has ended. I moved most of my things to my mother's, but my lease is mine until January, and my job is here, and it feels wrong to abandon a place like an animal you adopted. I keep the camera on, sometimes at 2:22 exactly. The rain seems to start even when the sky is clear. The picture fuzzes, a small shadow crosses. The motion light fails to catch anything. In the morning, there will be a smear or a strip of cloth, or a chalk circle on my back step like a target, but nothing in it. Last night, the chalk hopscotch was back on the step, and this time a stone sat on the first square, a round brook stone the size of a jaw. It had been wrapped in a scrap of knit blue tassel through a hole. Someone had tied a little piece of reflective tape around it, one of those you stick to a coat. I moved the stone with my shoe into the flower bed. I left the grid. I am telling myself this is a human thing, so human it hurts. A child, a man. A game that feels like a game until it doesn't. I am telling myself I have simply been pulled into the story they are making because we made one too. With microphones and an intro and a sound like a laugh that might have been the sound air makes when it leaves a small body that's running. When I woke at 3, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I didn't get up. I lay there and watched the camera picture grain into squares. A shadow slid across the window. The faintest tap sounded inside the wall behind my headboard, and a whisper came that could have been a cough or could have been my own heart in my throat. I could have reminded myself of Bluetooth and birds and foxes. I could have told myself about teenagers with time and apps and how chalk washes away. But what I heard instead, inside, not outside, like someone had finally gotten the window to lift the fraction they needed, was that small laugh, pinched in the middle so it could fit through spaces where voices aren't meant to go, and the breath on the end of it that smelled like wintergreen, and a voice not high or low so much as narrow, as if trying to stay thin and flat to slip between slats, saying from very near, "Play with me." Forever, I didn't move. I listened to the brook in my head even though the brook is 2 towns away. And I can only hear the highway hum in somebody's refrigerator and the way a house always talks to itself. In the morning, there was chalk under the bed where the rug doesn't quite reach. There were the prints of 2 small hands on the underside of the window trim, as if something had hung there and then dropped, careful, to the dark. And on my kitchen table, which I know I left clear except for the salt, lay a folded napkin, crisply, precisely folded, and inside it, where a mother might hide a note in a lunch, was that doll eye with the wire hook bent just so as if to catch and hold, and the smallest, neatest penciled word underneath that tiny glass stare. Written in perfect letters I recognize now from an old ledger, "Stay."